For those of you that are watching at home, the school committee has just returned from executive session where we conducted a strategy session in preparation for negotiations with the superintendent designate, a non-union employee, and strategy related to the Boston Teachers Union and negotiations with that collective bargaining unit. We will now continue with our regularly scheduled school committee meeting. Tonight's meeting is being broadcast live by Boston City TV on YouTube, as well as on Comcast Channel 24, RCN Channel 13, and FiOS Channel 1962. It will be rebroadcast at a later date. If you'd like to speak this evening but have not yet signed up, please see our staff person, Ms. Lena Parvex, in the hallway. Sign up for both public comment periods will close at 6:30 this evening. We'll begin with the approval of the minutes from the May 1st school committee meeting. Excuse me. If the minutes are approved as presented, hard copies will be made available immediately in the hallway with the other handouts. If changes are made, you can access the minutes tomorrow on the BPS website. At this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the May 1st, 2019 meeting as presented.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Is there a second? Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Is there any objection to approving the minutes by unanimous consent? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. Before we move on to the interim superintendent's report, I do want to take just a moment. We'll be hearing from her a little bit later, but I do want to recognize our superintendent designate. You get to have that title for the next 6 weeks or so. Dr. Brenda Caselius, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. We do have, as an order of business on the agenda tonight, a vote on the contract for Dr. Caselius, and so we'll have an opportunity when we get to that point to have you say a few words, but did want to welcome you dearly and say thank you once again for agreeing to come on board. So on to the interim superintendent's report. I present to you our interim superintendent, Ms. Laura Perot.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Lecanto, and good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. And I, too, would like to welcome our incoming superintendent, Dr. Brenda Caselius, who's with us this evening, as the chair noted. Dr. Caselius and I have met several times already over these past few days, and I can tell you that she is strongly committed to ensuring all of our students have equitable opportunities for a high-quality education in the Boston Public Schools. Her track record of narrowing opportunity and achievement gaps throughout her career is exactly the type of leadership that we want to continue here in the Boston Public Schools. This includes her time as a district leader in Memphis, the superintendent of an integration district near Minneapolis, and of course, her 8 years as Commissioner of Education for the state of Minnesota. I believe the chair will provide us with details about when Dr. Caselius will officially begin, but I want to share what a pleasure it is to begin working with Brenda already as she transitions into the role of leading the Boston Public Schools. She's eager to learn, willing to listen, and clearly brings tremendous enthusiasm and expertise to this very important role. She's also a tireless advocate for students, and from what I hear, she's also a mean hockey player who should fit in quite well during our cold winter months here in Boston, and we're very delighted that we could time it just right to welcome you to Boston in the midst of a Bruins playoff run. So prepare to start wearing black and gold soon. So again, I'd like to say congratulations and welcome to our next superintendent, Dr. Caselius. To share some highlights from around the district, this week marks Teacher Appreciation Week, and today is National School Nurse Day. Our teachers and our school nurses are often the adults that our students know and trust the most. We owe them a debt of gratitude year-round, but it's nice to see everyone taking some time to thank our teachers and school nurses for all they do. I'd like to give a shout out to the McKay School in East Boston, where they actually rolled out a red carpet for the teachers. A very fun idea, and I really love the fact that everyone got the students involved to show appreciation for the adults who are guiding them in their educational journeys. So with that, I'd like to say Happy Teacher Appreciation Week and Happy School Nurses Day. Moving on to STEM activities, about 50 BPS students participated in the Latino STEM Alliance Robotics and Science Competition this past Saturday at the Melnia Cass Recreational Complex. Students represented several BPS schools, including Gardner Pilot Academy, Boston Latin Academy, Mildred Ave K-8, the Horace Mann the Umana, Tech Boston Academy, the King, McKinley High, the Hernandez, and the winners, who were the autopilots from the Frederick Pilot Middle School. Exactly. The competition was a chance for students to demonstrate their skills in the engineering design process that were formulated in project-based and experiential learning settings. As we prepare our students for the STEM careers of today and tomorrow, opportunities like these are truly engaging and valuable in our students' learning. And on that note, what a joy it was for these two lucky BPS students pictured here, who got a huge surprise, receiving full ride scholarships from Boston Scholar athletes. Rosedina Blanc of Madison Park got a 4-year scholarship to Curry College, and Anne Marullo of Boston Latin Academy received a 4-year scholarship to Regis College. Both students had no idea that their parents, friends, and the media were waiting for them in an announcement last week at Madison Park. Rosedina, who's a volleyball player, said it was, quote, the best feeling I've ever felt. And Anne, who's a cheerleader, said, this is probably the best thing that's ever happened to me. Thank you to Scholar Athletes for supporting so many of our student athletes on and off the field, and congratulations to these outstanding students. And that, I will save the rest of my remarks for the introduction to our various reports, so that concludes my report.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Brill. I'll open it up now to members for questions and discussion. Ms. Robinson?
Just want to say again, thank you to the teachers and to the school nurses during this week of celebration. Thanks for all you do.
Well, thank you, Ms. Robinson, and certainly I know a number of parent councils across the city have been hosting events at the various schools in honor of our teachers, and I've seen a number of them at the Beethoven and Orenberger this week with where my children attend school, and so I'm really appreciative of parents as well as school administrators going the extra mile for the people that serve our kids the most and do so without praise or thanks every day. So thank you once again to those individuals. Moving on now to no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion to receive the interim superintendent's report as presented. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Tron. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Any objection to receiving the interim superintendent's report by unanimous consent? Hearing none, the motion is approved. The report is approved. Before we move on now to general public comment, I'd like to invite our student representative, Ms. Evelyn Reyes, to provide her monthly update. Ms. Reyes.
Hello all. I'd like to begin by sharing some highlights from the last couple of weeks. First, BSAC students participated in a rally to support the Green New Deal at the Strand Theater. This was in mid-April. They joined many other youth groups to make noise about the green policies we are in dire need of. And we've also had some opportunities in the past month to share student voice. The first of those was that BSAC representatives made their way to the Harvard Graduate School of Education to sit on a panel and discuss student organizing along with other youth groups from the New England area. And second, BSAC students attended a tour at BAA, and it was hosted by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation's Amplifying Student Voice and Leadership Project. It's kind of a mouthful. As a part of that, they explored BAA's restorative justice program, as well as attended a workshop from the Young People's Project, and they discussed the advisory program that BAA has, as well as the Health and Wellness Department's social and emotional supports. And upcoming opportunities to join students in solidarity, or one upcoming opportunity would be the Thursday, May 16th rally at the State House. We encourage all who can attend to make it there. It's part of the Fund Our Future movement to get the Promise Act passed in Massachusetts. We're urging lawmakers to pass the Promise Act, and BSAC played a key role in planning that action, especially the youth-led parts of it. And on another note, I have some shout-outs. So first of all, hello to Dr. Casalius, and BSAC looks forward to working with you. And on another note, BSAC would like to express tremendous gratitude to the Daily Table for supporting us this year by providing snacks for our meetings. We greatly appreciate them for feeding lots of hungry teenagers. And lastly, and bittersweetly, the students of BSAC want to thank Interim Superintendent Laura Peril for all of her work this year, because she's been a fantastic advocate for the student voice in Boston. And you know, this has gone from supporting the arts to simply knowing what our priorities are. And she's always been responsive when BSAC has called on her. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That is all.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Reyes. I'll open it up now to the members for questions or discussion. Well, hearing none, I do want to just note, thank you so much for mentioning the May 16th rally at the State House. I also, what that reminded me on was another event that's coming up soon. One of the members of the Boston delegation, Senator Will Brownsberger, is going to be hosting a listening session, which is next Monday, May 13th, at the Honan Alston branch of the Boston Public Library in Alston. It's, I believe, 6 to 8 p.m., and he's co-hosting it with Senator Jason Lewis, who is the incoming Senate co-chair of the Joint Committee on Education in the legislature. And what the Senate has been doing is embarking on a listening tour across the Commonwealth on what are the common sense reforms that our community members are seeking for reforming funding in our schools. And, you know, as a quick reminder to folks, we have not had a funding reform set in motion in this state since 1993. And the Chapter 70 formula has become outdated as a result of that. Our communities do not look like what they did in 1993. And so Boston in particular, but a number of other cities and towns around the state are certainly working hard towards a change to the way in which the state funds local education. We've had great partners in our students, BSAC in particular, as well as a number of community advocates all across the city and the Commonwealth in working towards reform. And the city and the district in particular has been moving towards strong support on behalf of the Promise Act, which was an act developed by Senator Chang Diaz of Jamaica Plain, and now has a number of co-sponsors across the legislature, which creates a new net minimum aid level for our education units across the state. And so we want to join with our cities and towns across the Commonwealth in arguing for minimum state aid for education. And Interim Superintendent Peril and I, along with members of the city's budget office, will be presenting on the 13th, along with a couple of other representatives of the towns of Belmont and Watertown, which are also in Senator Brownsberger's district, to talk about what it is that our communities need in order to provide the best educational opportunities possible for our students. So I hope you can join us. Mr. O'Neill.
Just one comment and then a question for Ms. Reyes. One is, as you look at the end of the year, as we come up in the end of the year and BSAC is thinking what the accomplishments of the year, I think pretty much top of your list should be the involvement of BSAC in the superintendent search. So from the initial community event that you hosted, that was probably the largest attended one, I believe, as well as having the student on the search committee for the first time ever, the involvement of students in the panel, your own involvement in this interview session. I think it's reached a high water mark for student involvement in a superintendent search, certainly here in this city and probably in many other cities as well. So I hope BSAC celebrates that as an accomplishment. And the question for you is, do we happen to know how many schools are now represented, how many high schools are now represented in BSAC? Has it moved at all during the course of the year?
It has shifted a little bit, and I can certainly get that data for you.
That'd be great, thanks, because you know we'd love to continue to help you. You've been kind enough to call out in the past schools that have not had representation, and would love to continue that effort to get BSAC represented in every high school in the city. But thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Neill, and thank you, Ms. Reyes. And I should note that we do have the BSAC annual report. I believe it's June 12th
yes.
is when we're scheduled to receive that report. We'll also be honoring our BSAC graduates at that meeting as well. All right, if there's no further questions, we'll move on now to general public comment. Ms. Sullivan?
Thank you, Mr. Lecanto. The public comment period is an opportunity for parents, students, and other concerned parties to make brief presentations to the school committee on pertinent school issues. Questions on specific school matters are not answered at this time, but are referred to the superintendent for a later response. Questions on specific policy matters are not answered at this time, but may be the subject of later discussion by the committee. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak, and I will remind you when you have 30 seconds remaining. Those who require interpretation services will receive an additional 2 minutes. Speakers may not reassign their time to others. Written testimony is appreciated and encouraged. Please state your name and affiliation before you begin. TV cameras will only record speakers who face the committee. We have 3 speakers this evening, beginning with Mr. Jack Sennett, and he'll be followed by Janelle Bruno and Jennifer Dines.
Good evening, Mr. Sennett.
Good evening. Chair, members, Superintendent, thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Jack Sennett, and I'm a parent of 3 students, all with IEPs at Boston Public Schools. I'm here to talk about Regxit, the West Roxbury transition, specifically for the Symphonize program, which is the inclusion program for autism strand kids at West Roxbury. Bottom line, it's going away. It's effectively died. And it gives me great pause for a couple of reasons. You know, they say that there's 2 stories to every, or 2 sides to every story, and sometimes there's more than that. And I think this is one of those cases. We went into impact negotiations with the assumption that there's the administration responsible for the institution and the union responsible for the teachers' interests, and that somehow student interests, particularly special needs student interests, would be sort of come out the other side and be adequately represented and supported. It turns out that didn't happen. I don't know why, and I don't care why. That's blame storming, and it doesn't help anybody. I would point out, however, that during discussions with the school committee, just about every school committee member specifically asked about Symphonize. Mr. O'Neill, I remember specifically, before the vote to close the school, asked what's going to happen with the autism inclusion program. Is it protected? In his voting statement, said, I understand that Symphonize will be protected. I'm going to vote to close the school and follow recommendations, but it's with that understanding. And when the negotiations broke down, the first question that I heard from you, sir, was, what about Symphonize? You guys told us that we protected. What's going on? I have grave concerns when the representatives of the people, if you will, the school committee, who have really the voice of the students and the population of Boston as their purview, that when their wishes somehow fall through the cracks in a very complicated and long set of negotiations, that there's something broken. And it's especially important when it happens around an inclusion program. As I believe Ms. Kane will outline in her report, inclusion has been a focus of BPS for 10, 15 years at least, since Dr. Johnson's time. And yet, to the best of my knowledge, the Symphonize is the only program where we attempted to take a Henderson-like model and push it out into high schools to spread that knowledge. And now it's effectively gone.
30 seconds.
I would ask you for 3 things, committee members. One is, we need to refocus on inclusion as a district-wide priority. It needs to be in every impact statement. It needs to be part of all planning, and that includes Build BPS. If there isn't a place for inclusion, then we're failing somehow. The next issue is, as I mentioned the last time I was up here, I think Ms. Burrell honestly was hit with a fait accompli. She does not have, and our incoming superintendent does not have the tools they need to provide flexibility the next time this happens. And I would urge you to please consider creating a Boston Education Endowment specifically for facilities so that the administration has the flexibility to solve these problems in future. The third thing is, and this is a biggie, in future negotiations of this sort, if there's a special needs impact, I would ask that you consider naming a member of SPEDPAC or someone from the community as a silent observer of those negotiations, to at least have somebody there who's not part of the 2 sides of the story, but can in person represent a third side of the story. and perhaps provide some transparency into what exactly is going on and make sure this doesn't happen again. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Sennett.
Sennett. Our next speaker is Janelle Bruno. She'll be followed by Jennifer Dines and Linda Freeman.
Hello, my name is Janelle Bruno, and I spoke here a few weeks ago regarding the need for more grade school seats in Charlestown. With the addition of Hood Park, the Graphic Lofts, One Charlestown, and other various developments in our neighborhood, including the neighboring Encore Casino, at least 2,800 new condos are being built in our neighborhood within 1 square mile. At the same time, many residents are choosing to stay in Charlestown so that our schools are unable to adequately provide for the children in our town. Moreover, construction on all 3 entryways to Charlestown has begun, leaving residents landlocked and traffic gridlocked. This issue affects everyone in our catchment area, including those in the Bunker Hill Public Housing, which is the largest public housing development in the city. Putting children on buses for an hour-plus ride across the city of Boston does not make sense for anyone. What does make sense is increasing the number of seats at the quality Level 1 schools in Charlestown so that more children of all socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds can have access to them, especially with such a high demand. Waitlists in Charlestown schools have doubled and in some cases tripled this year. At the Warren Prescott, for example, 29 of the available 44 seats are reserved for siblings of the school, leaving little opportunity for others to get access, and even lower odds for K-2 spots next year. The problem isn't impending. The problem is here and now. Our children don't have 3 to 5 years to wait for the system to catch up, and we need commitment from the city and the school to ensure the children of Boston have viable options for kindergarten placement. Tonight, I brought with me a group of families whose children were also waitlisted. Together with a group of 44 others, we created a petition and collected over 1,000 signatures in less than 10 days, urging Boston Public Schools to build capacity for more children in Charlestown and across Boston. In addition to creating a more fair and transparent lottery process. We have met with Counselor Edwards, Counselor Wu, and the Chair of Education for Boston, Counselor Asabi George, and are excited to open the discussion with BPS tonight as we deliver our petition. We are hopeful that together we can find a viable way to bring access for all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jennifer Dines, and she'll be followed by Linda Freeman.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Dines, and I'm the ESL 1 teacher and literacy director at the Frederick Pilot Middle School. I'm also a parent of BPS students as of next year, so my oldest 2 girls are going to be going to K-2. I'm here this evening to speak to you on behalf of myself and my colleagues about the positive impact of the Excellence for All initiative in the district. If you're not familiar with it, it's a program that's part of the Office of Opportunity and Achievement Gap that aims to improve academic outcomes for students with a focus on grades 4 to 6. And just my own personal response to whenever they show up in my school is that I know it's going to be a really good day because they are the people that the office that I can depend on the most in central office, that are always bringing resources to our school, supporting teachers, supporting administrators, and they truly have a team of experts in content and instruction. So people with specialized degrees, very broad experiences, for example, people that have worked in different districts across the nation that can pull expertise from different places that someone like me who's in a classroom wouldn't be able to gain all those perspectives. And it just amazes me that when sometimes in our district, when we see students have low academic skills, there's like a focus on, oh, what's the trauma, what's mental health going on with that in our middle schools. But I think that when the focus of teaching isn't the academic instruction per se, like we're thinking about these other categories, we've really missed something, and it's that school becomes traumatic in itself when we're asking students to do academic tasks that they're not academically prepared for. That's when you see behaviors in middle school classrooms and things like that. But what I really appreciate about Excellence for All is they're helping us to reframe and refocus on the academic skills and the content that students need in a rich way. And so I think that that's something to really consider in middle school when people report behaviors, like, okay, what's going on with the academic work? And I want to talk a little about my own students. They're immigrants to the United States. They've made a lot of changes. I'm usually their first teacher in the U.S. And just a lot of shifts that they're making with social status, weather, culture shift, as well as for non-ESL students in our school. We have a lot of students living below poverty, homelessness, and life is a daily struggle. So the teachers and I at my school have had to think really hard about what makes an impact for students with so many needs. And what we come back to again and again is that when students have really rich academic content with projects, with writing pieces and products, is that they connect with one another when they're achieving academic success. So we connected with EFA right after we developed a school-wide literacy plan for this year after gaining data from within internally that 97% of students at our school were not reading at grade level, most of them at a third grade level, so 3% reading at grade level in our school. And through work with EFA, they really got on board with us when we made a school-wide literacy intervention plan. We've already seen a 7% gain between now and between the beginning of the year and December on curriculum assessment. Is that 30 seconds? Okay, thank you. And so we've gotten the opportunity to receive writing pedagogy classes. In the packet, you'll find biography and biography pieces by my ESL 1 students as a result of this work. I brought a student's water cycle poster. This is for students that speak 4 different languages, collaborating on cyclical explanation, all through the guidance of this program and Dr. Brisk. And also, we've gotten a lot of consultation on a new ELA and social studies curriculum we're rolling out, support with grant writing to expand resources for academic writing, and also developing PD modules with an expert in academic vocabulary who's part of the team. I also was able to take a trip to Cuba with the EFA program with administrators, teachers, and everything. So I just wanted to add that I hope that the district offices and the public will recognize that this is happening and continue to support and augment, focus on rigorous academic instruction for all of our students.
Thank you, Ms. Dines.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to share that.
Our next speaker is Linda Freeman.
Good evening, Ms. Freeman.
Good evening, school committee. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak before you. Let me start from the beginning. My son, Tavis, entered BPS through the Winship. Thereafter, he went to the Matter Hunt, the Joseph Lee, the Bates, the Lila Frederick, and he's in the transitional LFI program at Boston Green Academy. Summer school on the ESY was at the Condon, the Murphy, the Frederick, and the Madison. All the schools have done major contributions to his progress. I want to thank Boston Public Schools for that. But I also want you to realize that while our students are going through these transitions, each one is different. And if you don't have a SPED child, then you have no idea what the daily routines are for parents or guardians day to day. And if you don't ever walk into the classrooms, then you don't see what they go through, our staff, our teachers, our parents go through with our students. If you go there, it would be greatly appreciated to go there with a very objective view and not to penalize anyone, regardless of what you see. Because there are times you may see something that doesn't seem so-called appropriate. Maybe that's something that's just a trigger that occurred that you don't know that happened 20 minutes before you arrived. Can you handle it? If you can't handle it, then you have no understanding of what our SPED teachers and staff go through, nor do you understand what our parents and guardians go through. The other thing I would like you to recognize is this. when it comes to our English language learners, they vary. And depending on what country they come from, the language is different and the dialects are different. When we talk about our Latino kids, they come from different countries. Do you realize that even though they are Spanish speaking, the dialects are different? You may not know that on this level, but the students all recognize it immediately, that they know who's from what region or makes them question from what region. Don't paint stroke. It shows how much you do not understand, but how much they are impacted by not understanding that ELL is necessary and it is crucial to their education. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Freeman. Mr. LaCanto, that concludes our speakers for general public comment.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. We'll move on now to the first action item this evening, which is an international travel request for students from Boston Latin School to travel to Quebec. I'd like to turn it over to the interim superintendent for any final comments.
This is, I won't say one of the last, but this is toward the tail end of our many spring trips. But other than that, a fairly straightforward request.
Well, very good. Are there questions from the committee? Well, thank you. If there are no further questions, I'll entertain a motion to approve the international travel request as presented.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Tron. Any discussion or objection? Excuse me. Hearing none, the travel request is approved. Our next action item, excuse me. It's allergy season and I have a tickle in my throat, pardon me.
Welcome to the club.
Our next action item this evening is the approval of a contract for the superintendent designate, Dr. Brenda Caselius. You'll recall that on May 1st, the committee selected Dr. Caselius as the next superintendent of the Boston Public Schools and agreed to enter into contract negotiations with her. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Tron, as well as our BPS legal advisor, Ms. Kathy Lazat, for working on this contract with me. If approved this evening, this contract will be available to the public once it is signed by all the parties. So at this time, I'd like to highlight the major terms of the agreement. First up, it is a 3-year agreement, valid starting on July 1, 2019 and lasting through June 30th, 2022. The contract also has a 2-year extension clause, which would take it through the end of the school year in 2024, which would vest automatically based on the superintendent's performance through the first 2 years of the agreement. In particular, that'll be based specifically on the DESE mandated performance evaluation that we undertake each year with the superintendent. And so long as the superintendent attains a majority vote of either proficient or exemplary on the DESE scale, that option will vest. With regard to compensation, the initial starting salary will be $280,000 a year, and that contract will then include 2% annual cost of living increases. And just to give you some context for where we arrived at the figure for the initial starting salary, we had a number of reference points that we called upon in negotiations that is similar and consistent with the data points that we have used in negotiating with prior superintendents, including Dr. Chang, Dr. Johnson, and those that came before those two individuals. One reference point is the Council of Great City Schools Superintendent Survey, Superintendent Salary Survey, which actually hasn't been updated since 2014. But in 2014, the average salary for superintendents in Council of Great City School Districts, which for many of you know is the 75 largest school districts in the country, the average was $255,000 in 2014. Extrapolating that out and assuming a 2% annual increase, the average today would be right in line with what the the salary is that's been agreed upon in this contract, or is proposed to be agreed upon in this contract. A couple other data points, as many of you know, Dr. Chang began in his tenure at $257,000, and ended his tenure at a rate of $267,000. And Dr. Chang came in without prior leadership experience. He had not led a district prior or led a large organization such as a state board. In Dr. Caselli's case, she comes to us with 8 years of experience, having run the Minnesota Department of Education, MDE, as well as a year of experience as a superintendent in Minnesota as well. Carol Johnson was the other data point then in 2007, after coming to us from prior superintendencies in Minneapolis and Memphis. Dr. Johnson agreed to a $275,000 initial contract, and notably, given the fiscal headwinds that all of us faced in the late 2000s, Dr. Johnson did not accept any wage increases during the duration of her contract. Just a few other comparables, again, looping back to the Council of Great City Schools, comparable districts out there, both in terms of size as well as cost of living. We look to Austin, Texas, where the superintendent there earns approximately $311,000 a year, and on the West Coast, the towns of Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, where those superintendents each, in the most recent year available, 2018, earned $295,000. All three of those individuals have been in their roles for a number of years. So that's how we landed with respect to wages, and wages will progress over time with respect to the cost of living increases that are included in the contract. A couple of other items that I want to remark upon. Again, we've aligned the performance review provisions of the contract to what the DESE schedule looks like. So we'll have a midterm review right around Thanksgiving every year, and an end of year summative evaluation that occurs in the summer. We will have a number of other benefits in the contract that are consistent with benefits that we were provided to Dr. Chang, to Dr. Johnson, and others, including a car allowance, moving expenses, some transition funding to adjust to the cost of living, the high cost of living in Boston. We will also be providing an executive coach for the first year for the new superintendent as she assumes her duties. So, all in all, again, I want to thank Dr. Casellius for her urgent efforts in getting this contract done and working with the Mass Association of School Superintendents, who were helpful in advising on this contract. I want to thank again the legal advisor, Kathy Lazat, for advising us on the terms here and being nimble to bring in terms from Dr. Johnson's and Dr. Chang's contracts. So nothing new here is, nothing in these contracts is new to any of us. And certainly to Dr. Tron Mr. Tron, you are a doctor, you got a Juris Doctor, for helping out on the negotiation and review of the contract as well. So I want to open up now to members for questions and discussion. Mr. O'Neill.
So I will simply a comment. I thank you for the salary review that you did, and I think it's perfectly appropriate the way you looked at the Council Great City School average from 2014, extrapolated up, looked at the experience of Dr. Chang and Dr. Johnson compared to Dr. Casellius, and also when you mentioned looking specifically right now at Austin, Seattle, and Portland, which are three similar districts in size. I do want to point out just a minor point to what you said, that the superintendent in Austin has been in his seat for a while. The superintendent in Portland is actually fairly new, I think about a year or so.
Okay.
But other than that, and it's obviously a high-cost city. But I really appreciate that you did that, and also I like the idea of the 3-year contract and then the 2-year option upon, and thank you for tying it to the DESE requirement of the superintendent evaluation process, and that holds our feet to the fire as well to make sure that the evaluations are done on time and in the appropriate process. So I think it's going to be very important that we do the goal setting right up front. And obviously, this will be new for Dr. Casellius. I'm not sure how it was in your prior state, but the goals in the first year are very different from goals in year 2, year 3, et cetera, because the first year is expected to be a transition year. And so I appreciate the fact that the option, I think you said, Mr. Chair, is based upon the evaluation after the end of the second year?
That's
Is that what
correct.
you said? Okay, so that will trigger whether it automatically happens.
Correct.
So I think that is certainly prudent and is a reflection of experiences learned here from the past. So I thank you and Mr. Tron for your work on this.
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Did you have something to
I
add,
just,
Dr.?
we talked about this earlier,
Coleman.
just committing to try to complete the evaluations by June 30th, so that in June, not July, even though it's due in July, we should work to get it completed before that, so we have time to review and consider it.
Indeed, thank you. And Dr. Coleman, as you mentioned at the end of the meeting last week, and just for folks that weren't here for new business, we did talk specifically about working as a committee to try to adapt what the DESI process is specifically for the experience in Boston, because as we know, the DESI performance review process has not looked has been a hard match to a number of the urgent needs and performance metrics that we want to impose upon our superintendent in Boston. And so I'll thank you for raising that once again. You've raised it in the past, and hope that we can work on that in the near future.
I did spend some time going through the materials this past week, and I actually think their structure is fine. It's just a matter of how the actual data we ask for and how we integrate what we're looking for with our articulated strategic plan, so that Dr. Caselius can integrate her performance review with what we're expecting. We just need to be more precise and accurate in the way we ask the questions and what the data we ask to represent progress. I think it'll be very doable.
Very good. Are there other questions or concerns from the membership? Okay. Well, we have had two executive sessions now to discuss this in preparations for negotiation and for consummating a contract. And so I definitely appreciate the urgency with which the committee has attacked this, and the timely feedback that's been provided with respect to a number of the provisions within the contract. So if there are no further questions or concerns from the committee, I will entertain a motion to approve Dr. Caselius's employment agreement as presented.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Oliver Davila. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion?
Mr. Chair, I just want to point out that I appreciate you say that we talked about this in executive session, but I do this is the first time the public is hearing the details of the contract, so I appreciate you giving the detailed rundown of the key issues of it, and the fact that we, have done, or you, on behalf of us, have done the work to make sure that this is prudent and appropriate. A lot of people will look and see the salary and say, boy, that's an awful lot of money. But in the world of big city superintendents, it is, in fact, quite reasonable, particularly when you consider Boston's cost of living, et cetera. So I think it is a reasonable, prudent approach, and I thank you for the work on it, and I support the effort.
Thank you again, Mr. O'Neill. Are there any?
There's a 41% increase over Minneapolis cost of living.
I see somebody else has been doing his homework as well. She hasn't signed on the dotted line yet.
You made that transition.
The Three Stooges routine aside, are there any other further questions or comments? Mr. O'Neill, like you have something to say.
Even before I should probably wait until after, if I may make one comment after we vote, sir.
Of course. Ms. Sullivan, will you please call the roll?
Dr. Coleman,
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Rivera,
Yes.
Ms. Robinson,
Yes.
Mr. Tran,
Yes.
Ms. Oliver Davila,
Yes.
Mr. Lecanto.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Well, thank you again, Ms. Sullivan, and congratulations to you, Dr. Caselius. We very much look forward to having you start in a few short weeks. It will feel very short as it comes upon us. We had you here tonight because we wanted to, congratulate you in person and be able to say thank you. But I'd love to invite you up and offer any comments yourself. I know you've been meeting a number of folks around town recently, and we're very appreciative of you being in town. So please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, all the members, for your confidence and trust and just the overwhelming positive and loving support that I've gotten from the Boston community since I've started. I'm just so overwhelmed and humbled by the incredible reception that I've gotten so far, and I just can't thank you enough for the work that you've done to really look at the contract and to look at the strategic direction of the district and the work that's ahead of all of us. I'm very anxious to get started. As you know, I've been here, and you said, okay, well, you know, I'm looking forward to get started. I feel like I've already kind of started. And I just want to thank Laura, Superintendent Perrell, for your incredible graciousness of opening up your team to helping with the transition. They've just been stellar. The wonderful welcome from the teachers and the community and the parents, and just everybody's been absolutely fabulous, and the students as well. I'm going to hopefully have a meeting with you all next week. So that's really exciting. I know you guys are testing and finishing, so I don't want to be too disruptive to students as they finish up their school year. So just very thankful and hopeful for the future of Boston and the children and the families and communities that live here. So I'm anxious to hurry up and find a place to live and have Boston become my home. Go Bruins. And Celtics and Red Sox and everybody.
Don't give up too quickly. You know, come on. You can love it here without being here.
Yes.
No, you can't. You have to love it.
Well, Dr. Casellas, as you can see, we're very excited to have you here. And as you noted, you've already hit the ground running. You've
Yes.
been off at the mayor's coffee hour in Charlestown this morning, meeting parents and out in the community. You've been to meet our colleagues on the city council today. You've been up at the State House with the Mass Association of Superintendents today. And we're really looking forward to having you in town in advance of July 1st so that you can get to know our district very deeply, get to know our community very deeply. And we'll be working to arrange a transition team for you in those weeks, and we look forward to working with you during that time. And as you know, this is a weighty job. Superintendent Perrell can certainly attest to that. I think you've had more than your share of 20-hour days over the last year. And
A few.
yes, and I'm sure you'll get
I've had
used
the
to that
20-hour days.
quite quickly,
Yes.
and can draw on a number of your past experiences in that regard. In any case, we did not have you here, obviously, last week when we did have an opportunity to vote you in as superintendent, and so I do want to just offer my colleagues an opportunity to say a few words, if they so please.
Thank you.
Members.
Just
Ms.
wanna
Robinson?
Just want to say welcome.
you.
We're glad that you're here. There's a lot of work to be done, so we're ready to support you and making this the best district for all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms.
What
Robinson.
she said.
Okay.
Dr. Casellas, welcome. We're delighted you're here. I do want to say thank you for showing, even during the contract that we talked about tonight, that you are here for the work, not for the job. And you very clearly showed what your interests are and what you want to accomplish, and we look forward to working with you to achieve the goal that you laid out, which is during one of the interview questions when you asked what you want to be known for 5 years from now, is that Boston Public Schools is the school of choice for all the parents in the city, and we look forward to working with you to achieve that goal.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill.
Welcome, Dr. Casellas. We're really excited to have you, and thank you for your openness. We've had some conversation, and I really appreciate your proactive approach. So I had asked Dr. Casellas to meet with the Greater Boston Latino Network and some other members, and I said, like, June or July. She's like, no, let's do it now. So I really appreciate your understanding and the conversation we had around my comments at the last school committee. And I do want to say, publicly that although my vote was different, that you were a top choice for me. So I want people to know that that I think that you're very talented and skilled, and I'm really excited to be able to work with you. And again, excited to work with someone who gets it and understands the comments that I was making, and willing to work with our community. So I look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Mr. Tron.
Welcome to Boston, and thank you for accepting our offer,
Yes.
the job to you, and I'm looking forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tron. Dr. Rivera.
Yes. So, bienvenida. I'm really also want to express a welcome to Boston as well. Very excited about working together. I know you really impressed the hardest groups to impress, you know, the community, the parents, and the advocates, and so that is so important. So we believe in you, and we're going to work with you. So welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. Ms. Reyes.
Yeah, welcome again. We look forward to working with you, the students, and I hope that we'll see you around school, that you'll be a familiar face for all of us. Yeah.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Well, thank you again, fellow members, and thank you again, Dr. Cassellius. We know you've still got a packed dance card this evening, so we'll let you go for now, but we'll look forward to working with you in the coming weeks and months as we bring you on board.
And thank you all of you. I'm very excited to get on board and get going. So very much thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you. Okay, we will move on now to our first report of this evening, which is our annual update from the Boston Special Education Parent Advisory Council, which is also known as SPEDPAC. At this time, I'd like to invite the chair of SPEDPAC, Ms. Carolyn Kane, forward to please step forward with her presentation. But first, I'd like to turn things over to our interim superintendent for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto, and good evening, Ms. Kane. Tonight, we will receive an annual update on the work of the Boston Special Education Parent Advisory Council. SPEDPAC is one of our citywide parent advisory councils and the one that gives voice and support for the parents of children with special needs. It's made up exclusively of parent volunteers and works with the Boston Public Schools to ensure all students get the services and support they need to develop their full potential. There are more than 11,000 students, or 20% of the Boston Public Schools, classified as having special needs. Tonight's presentation will be made by Carolyn Kane, the chairperson, but I want to thank all the members of SPEDPAC, and in particular, Chairperson Kane, both personally and on behalf of the district, for her tireless and principled advocacy on behalf of our students with disabilities, and for her willingness to engage in collaborative problem solving to help the Boston Public Schools continue to strengthen and improve our services for all students. So with that, thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Superintendent Burrell. Thank you, Chairman Lecanto. Thank you, Vice Chair Olivedera, and thank you, members of the school committee. I am Carolyn Kane. I am the chair of Boston SPEDPAC. It's a role that I've been in for about a decade now. It is, in fact, a volunteer role. So on behalf of SPEDPAC, I will be making the presentation this evening, not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of the entire SPEDPAC board, and most importantly, on behalf of special needs families throughout the district. I want to start out by first thanking Superintendent Burrell for her incredibly collaborative and responsive leadership that she has shown throughout her entire tenure. I will say that it is unparalleled with her predecessors, and I have been truly impressed with the amount of time, effort, commitment, and dedication that she has given to our students throughout her entire time here. I think that people were skeptical during her first appointment, when she was first appointed, but I will say that I have been impressed and very grateful that she was, in fact, our superintendent during this period of time. So thank you, Superintendent Burrell. I would also like to welcome Dr. Cassellius, although I know she just left, because I'm sure she has a million things to do. But part of my presentation was to help inform her, as well as the new members of the school committee, Mr. Tran and Dr. Rivera, about the role of SPEDPAC, because it is a statutorily required position in Massachusetts, so that may differ from Minnesota, and it may not be something familiar to all of our school committee members. So, and since I'm not limited to 3 minutes this evening, sit back and relax, because I'm going to be a while. So I also want to thank the entire special education department led by Cindy Nielsen. I think that too often our special education department is overlooked and not appreciated for the work that they do day in and day out, which is a very difficult job and a very challenging job. And so I want to thank Cindy for her leadership, and I want to thank her staff for their commitment and dedication to our students. I also want to thank Dr. Granson for the opportunity to work with him during the past year, and I look forward to doing that on the go forward. I do want to note that my daughter is going to be 20 years old in June of 2019. So my stay with SpedPAC in the Boston Public Schools is time limited. I do want to see a successful transition to a new board with a new administration, but what that role will actually look like remains to be seen. I've certainly dedicated well over 1,000 hours of volunteerism, including 70-plus hours just on the selection committee alone. So I'm sure I'm underestimating what the time I've spent. My husband would probably be able to give you a better estimate, but here we go. So the role of Boston SpedPAC. I think it is important to note that unlike other parent organizations and other advocacy groups, that the Special Education Parent Advisory Council is in fact required by statute. And it's not only required to exist and for the school committee to establish, but it's required that that we meet as the SpedPAC Advisory Council to meet regularly with school officials to participate in the planning, development, and evaluation of the district's special education programs. So it's not just we weigh in with our opinion, but our involvement in the planning, development, and evaluation process is required by law. So I do think that's a distinct difference. Over the years, BPS has partnered with BPS, and that working relationship has continued to grow and is very well established. I myself meet weekly with Cindy Nielsen, and we talk about ongoing issues. She's available to me, quite frankly, 24/7. As issues come up, as you know that they do in special education, she's incredibly responsive to whatever is going on in the district, and certainly I don't know everything on any given day, but when I do raise an issue, she's been very responsive to this. The executive board also, under our bylaws, meets quarterly with the superintendent, so you might want to mention that to Brenda. That's sort of pursuant to our bylaws. And what we do is we try to facilitate connecting parents with the appropriate personnel in special education to address any issues they might be having, whether it has to do with their child's IEP, the services under their IEP, or even transportation issues, which has been a big issue this year. There are just under 11,000 students with disabilities in BPS, which is about 20% of the current student population, and almost 1/3 are also ELL students. We hold monthly meetings for our membership, which includes all parents of students on IEPs throughout the district. And what we try to do is provide parents with information to empower them about their child's and their special education rights, laws and procedures that go along with that, and also what the district's responsibilities are with regard to special education. During my tenure, we have established, not by me, but through the members of the SpedPAC board, our own website, our phone number, and an email list, since emails are private information to parents unless they opt in to share them with us. And then we try to also connect parents through the larger community through both our Facebook page and our Twitter accounts, neither of which do I handle. I've got enough problems with my own Facebook and Twitter account, so moving on. So inclusion has been and remains a priority for the Boston SpedPAC. As you know, under state and federal law, students are required to be educated in the least restrictive environment. And what that means is that they're to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate, and only when the nature and severity of their disability is too great that should they be removed to substantially separate settings. And I kindly provided all the federal and state sites for that law. So this has been a long focus of SpedPAC, and throughout my entire tenure and before then, it's been a focus because, quite frankly, special education itself, it's not a special education issue. It's a district-wide issue, and it's not been adequately addressed or funded in well over a decade. I think the issue that we need to talk about with regard to inclusion is that in order to increase inclusion, which is what is required by law for our students, we really need to have a shift in culture throughout BPS. That's from the superintendent to the administration and central office to school leaders and to our teachers. We're in the business of supporting children and not meeting the needs of adults. And I think that that is something that needs to be reinforced always, and that accountability needs to be in place. So when I started in the role of SPED PAC, we had around 42 to 46% of our students with disabilities in substantially separate classrooms. The reason for that was multifaceted. One had to do with the assignment process, where children who have special needs generally enter into the school district on their third birthday when they age out of early intervention. The school district has an assignment process that is time set. And so people apply for and enter into the lottery for seats in the Boston Public School systems, and there were never any seats left over for special education students. So instead of having the option of going into inclusion, they defaulted into sub-separate classrooms because that's all that was left. The problem is once they went into those sub-separate classrooms, their educational trajectory and lifelong process in terms of education was already set in stone. That needs to change in BPS. We've certainly made progress under the recent years in terms of developing more early education programs that provide for inclusion opportunities and change that onset of what's happening in putting children in inclusion and not going into substantially separate. We have 11,000 children in BPS on IEPs. 36% of them are still in substantially separate settings. And what do I hear about in regards to what it is that we can do to move these children out of substantially separate settings? I hear about, well, our school doesn't do that. Or, well, as teachers, we have to vote on whether or not that should happen. Or, we need to, if we're going to do that, we need to have co-teaching. No, you need to do what's appropriate for our students. There is no one-size-fits-all to inclusion. Inclusion is an experience. It is not a location, and it's not a preset determination of the supports and services that any individual child needs. We have multi types of inclusion already in the district that are quite successful. So when I hear about the issue is being hung up on what adults want, it's very infuriating and very frustrating. We need to turn the tide in this district and start thinking more about the children than we do about adults. And I say that out of the utmost respect for our teachers and our staff, both in central office and in our schools. I can tell you that my own child has been blessed to have some of the finest teachers in the Boston Public Schools since she started over 15 years ago. We have had incredibly talented people work with my child. But I also know that my child's in the 2% of the most severely impacted individuals with IEPs. What she needs is not what every other child needs in the district. What we have is 1 in 5 children have a specific learning disability. Do they need the same thing as my nonverbal child who has an intellectual disability? Absolutely not. We need to look at options and we need to look at opportunities. And we can't be constrained, certainly by any collective bargaining agreement, but more importantly, we have to be driven by what the needs of the children are. So inclusion has made progress. We're certainly not where we need to be. We are still well above the federal and state average for children being in substantially separate settings, and we need to do a better job. But in order to do a better job, we need to invest more money. We talk about what improvements have been made, yet our budget has either remained stagnant or it's been decreased over the last 5 to 7 years. In order to make progress, you got to put more money in. It's sort of like fixing your house, right? Do you want a better roof and better windows? Well, you got to pay for them, right? Or do you want to save money on your heating bill, but all your heat's going out the windows? Well, unless you put in better windows, it's the same money going out the window every year. We have probably $30 million in out-of-district placements. Why is that? Because we haven't built the programs in districts to allow our children to be educated within BPS. No parent wants to send their child to an out-of-district placement. They want their child to go to the school closest to their home, provided it's a quality education that meets their individual needs. We haven't done that in BPS. And what does it take? It takes more investment. I know we have a limited amount of resources, but it's about priorities. What are our priorities? And if you want to save money, you have to invest money up front to ultimately do that in the end. So with regard to inclusion, I've been on probably 4 task forces for inclusion, currently a working group, but, those working groups include people that are currently doing inclusion, and parents, and previous school leaders, and, the director of special education. We need to get people involved in the movement to increase inclusion for the schools that aren't doing it, and for the schools that aren't doing a good job in meeting the needs of students with special education. I've heard of, exam schools recently that aren't meeting the needs of students with disabilities because they're saying, well, we don't have those resources currently available. Really? I think you have more resources than most of the other schools in BPS. So let's stop shortchanging the children with disabilities who are being faced with challenges every day. Every day that a child doesn't get the services that they need is a day that they'll never make up in their life. Their time in BPS is limited from the age of 3 up to the age of 22. And the goal for students, all parents, and all staff should be to provide that student with the best opportunities possible to prepare them for adult life, because adult services they're not a benefit. They're a benefit, they're not a right, okay? So we have special education laws, and then when you graduate from school or you turn 22, all of those rights disappear, and all of a sudden you're subject to annual appropriation. So we need to prepare our children as best possible before they exit the school system so that they can be the most independent and self-sufficient as possible. And in order to do that, we need to invest more money in special education. So, as I said, the other issue is that a lot of times people talk about special education or the special education department, and that, I've heard criticisms that they're difficult to work with, or, schools are having difficulty with them. I disagree. I've been in this role for 10 years now, okay? School leaders need to be held accountable, and that has not been the mindset in BPS. The special education department should be consulted about what it is that schools need to support them. It is up to the school leader in the district to implement and oversee the implementation of that IEP, to ensure that students are getting the services that are required in that IEP. There is no way that central office can oversee every IEP in every school throughout the district on a daily basis. It's the responsibility of our school leaders, and sadly, it's a responsibility that many of them have not embraced and in fact rebuffed. So I think that needs to be a cultural shift in this district. These school leaders serve at the pleasure of the superintendent. If they don't want to do the job to serve all students in BPS, I'm sure they can find employment elsewhere. The next issue I want to talk about has to do with transition services. So transition services are, again, required for students who, beginning at age 14, up to when they graduate from school or they turn age 22. I provided you with the site on the law for that. Just as a reference, you might want to share it with Dr. Casalius. Currently, in Boston Public Schools, we have over 4,300 students with disabilities who are ages 14 to 22, meaning that they are entitled to transition services. Now, I'm not going to suggest for 1 minute that other districts throughout the state are also masterful at transition services. It's been a learning curve for all districts throughout the state. We just happen to be the largest. So we have 4,300 students that are really supposed to be focused on, what do you want to do post-secondary? Do you want to move on to further education? Do you want to be employed and not go to school? Or do you really need to focus on your independent living skills so that you can access a group home even, depending on what their needs are? So back in 2016 and 2017, it was the first budget cycle that there was a targeted investment for transition services. That was for just over $1 million for over 4,000 students. That amounts to less than $250 per student. Since that time, there's been no additional investment in transition services. Yet we are expected to prepare children to go out into the adult world and to be able to make their way. Completely insufficient, completely inadequate, and continues to be a struggle. Now, the money that has been allocated has been spent well on establishing partnerships with other outside entities. And, there's some great programs out there, but they're certainly not reaching the 4,000 students that are eligible for them. Transition services look different depending on your age. Now, at 14, you're not in a job, right? But you can be talking about how to answer questions or explain yourself or self-advocate for yourself. You move on to 16, you might want to start your first job. How do you do an interview? How do you write a resume? How do you look for jobs? There's a lot of what people call them soft skills, but they're actually critical life skills, because without the ability to do those things, you're not going to be successful as an adult. And I can tell you, as someone that works for the state in Health and Human Services, is that what we see is a lot of kids graduate or, leave special education, and they're completely unprepared for the adult life. They try to get into employment, or they try to go on to future education, and they fail miserably. And it's because nobody had paid attention to what their deficits were while they were still in special education, because maybe they were doing well academically. That's great. But do they have any social skills? Do they have any executive functioning skills to get themselves dressed and out the door every day and get to a job on time? These are the critical life skills that need to be paid attention to. And we're asking our special education teachers to do an awful lot. Currently, the special education department only has 6 Strive employees to train all of our special education teachers across this district for over 4,000 students. I mean, I just have to say the numbers, and they speak loudly on themselves, right? I did steal the next slide from Cindy on the budget for 2020. So these are, because people will say, oh, no, we did put in more money. So we have 7 new ABA specialists, a 6-member team to, provides all of these things that are listed as highlights in the FY20 budget are necessary expenses for the current IEPs that are in place and the legal responsibilities that exist for the district already. So please don't consider them additional investments, because that's not what they are. They're meeting the needs that are required currently by law. Additional investment means that we're going to do better than we have been doing in the past. So one of the things I talk about, and I've talked about in my previous presentations, is that there should be a tiered approach to intervention. Since I started in BPS, and well before I started in BPS, there were only 2 options: special education or regular education. And if something was wrong with a child and they weren't on academic par, they weren't on social par, they weren't on behavioral par, refer them over to special ed. That's not what we do. And that's not what is supposed to happen under the law. No Child Left Behind talks about a tiered approach to intervention, which is identify where a child is behind and give them increased support. If that doesn't work, you increase the support once again. It's only till you get the 3rd and 4th level should there be a referral to special education. But this goes back to what I mentioned previously. It's a culture in BPS that all schools, all school leaders, and all school staff are responsible for every student throughout the district. You're not a general ed teacher and you only teach general education, and if a child has a challenge or a need, you scoot them off to special education. No, we're all about everyone here, and all is all. When I say that, I mean that because, when students get referred to special education, they often don't come out. And that's an inappropriate referral in an inappropriate place to put a child, where if you gave them a little extra help, they could have made up that difference. Children have different opportunities when they're in preschool and early education. Some have more opportunities in terms of their education, more opportunities in terms of social engagement, more opportunities. We have a lot of children in this district who have experienced trauma. Obviously, the impacts on them are going to show. That doesn't mean that they need to be on an IEP for the rest of their life. We need to start looking at things differently and meeting children where they are, and not saying you're either bucket A or bucket B. We need to increase supports across the school district, across the grade levels, at an earlier point in time, so children don't end up on IEPs. We have 20% of our kids in BPS on IEPs. That is higher than than the state average or the federal average. Now, you could say, well, maybe that's because we've got better evaluations in Boston, we have better hospitals. No, we're referring too many kids to special education because there aren't any other options. So we need to take a look at that, and we need to redirect the decisions that adults are making about children to make sure that they're getting the appropriate interventions at the appropriate point in time. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about is that, and I say this as far as my professional life, and for the new members, I'm actually I'm the executive director of the Autism Commission for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So personally, I've done the journey of special education, and then because of the difficult challenge I had when entering BPS, I then chose to focus on special education in my professional life. And that's gone on to take on other roles as well, and my current one is on behalf of the state. And what I know is that as a parent entering BPS, or as a parent just having a child diagnosed with a disability, they don't come with a handbook. You don't know what resources exist, and our school personnel don't know what other resources exist. There happens to be a lot of other services that are available out there, and I think that the goal should be a collaborative effort with the state and with people like myself to make sure that school personnel are helping to facilitate connecting parents with appropriate resources. We have the Department of Developmental Services, which is known for having, being the referral under 688 where adults go to. Well, there happens to be a children's autism waiver program, and there also happens to be a DDS DESE program, which is funded by the Department of Education. But what it does is it provides services to families in addition to the services that you get from your IEP, that the parent directs how those resources will be spent. You can include things like additional ABA, BCBA, respite, community activities. And so for a lot of our families who are struggling financially, helping to connect them with those resources is significant. I will say that Governor Baker has proposed a $4 million increase to that program in the next year, and I hope that that goes through because it would serve an additional 250 plus families. But helping families to know about resources helps them to access them. Mass Rehab Commission has a pre-EDS program that deals with transition services. So it's not to supplant what it is that the school district offers, but it can certainly supplement, and it can provide students with additional opportunities in their communities and for job training and job coaching that are available at no cost to the family. We have the Children's Behavioral Health Initiative through Mass Health, which is available for children struggling, and they don't need to be on the autism spectrum. Under the Massachusetts Autism Omnibus Law enacted in 2014, Mass Health extended its coverage for ABA services, which is in addition to the Eureka Law of 2010, which required private insurers to cover medically necessary treatment for autism. Autism has not decreased in its prevalence. It's currently 1 in 59, with 4 times as many boys as girls being diagnosed with autism. This issue is not decreasing. It's continuing to increase, and it's continuing to stay. So I look at it as a partnership, between SPEDPAC and between the school district, that we're here to help parents understand about special education, but also understand what other resources are available to them. But it has to be a true partnership with the district. First of all, in recognizing the scope of the need, investing more money, which I'm sure that ELL feels the same way, but also what I think is special education and English language learners department need to have cabinet level positions. They're too important to put them under somebody else. And I say that with the utmost respect. They're dealing with unique issues, and they're dealing with crisis on a lot of regards. And quite honestly, it's too big to ask somebody to take it all on in terms of all the respective departments. I appreciate Charles' work, and I think he and I have had some very robust and good conversations and have some goals about future work. But I honestly think that the reason that ELL and special education have been for lack of a better term, so neglected for such a long period of time is because they've never been given a proper seat at the table to have that voice heard. And I think that that needs to change. So, you know, in conclusion, I would just like to say that, again, thank you, Superintendent Perrell. Thank you, Special Education Department. Thank you, members of the school committee. I'm not going away yet, but my time is very limited on the go forward. So it's probably going to be my most robust year because I want to maximize what it is that I'm able to achieve before I leave. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Kane, and you always hold the district and each of us to our feet to the fire, and we appreciate you for that because you deliver your criticism and your praise directly, and that's what we need in order to continue to do our duty as the fiduciaries of this district, and we greatly appreciate that. So I want to take an opportunity now to open up to members for questions or discussion. We'll start with Dr. Rivera.
Thank you so much. This is really a great presentation. I'm a new member of the committee, so I'm learning about all of this. I just had like a couple of clarifying questions. You mentioned that there's a large percentage of students that are placed out of the district, and I wondered, like, how does that compare to like the state average? Because you made some great comparisons around you know, the percentage that have IEPs, you know,
Well, what I
higher.
will say is that with regard to, I don't know the exact percentage. I'm sure that Cindy Nielsen could help you out with that. Clearly, we are the largest district in the state, right? So we have the highest population. I don't think that our percentage is necessarily higher compared to other districts given their population size. But what I know is that the reason that we're sending students out of district to be educated is because we don't have the appropriate programs in district, and it's much more costly to send a child to be educated in a private special education program, including transportation. In fact, a lot of times the transportation cost can exceed the tuition cost for an out-of-district placement. And so we talk about that that's a high cost every year, but we never do anything about it. We never invest any more money to bring kids back into the district by creating specialized programs, you know, to create more language-based learning programs. 1 in 5 children have a specific learning disability. We don't have enough language-based programs, and certainly not at the middle and high school level. So that's how parents prevail in getting an out-of-district placement, is showing that the district doesn't have an appropriate program in place. And I think that our costs are so high because our volume of students is so high. And so, you know, and there's the transportation cost as well. But I don't know that we, as a district, have a higher percentage than other districts given our special education population. I just don't know the answer to that.
Thank you. Just one more question. So you mentioned also that, you know, the need for expanding existing inclusion programs to all grade levels. Does that mean that not all grade levels currently have inclusion programs? I don't know if you could say more about that.
Sure. Okay, so in the district currently, we have 2 full inclusion programs that go from K0 to K12 and up to age 22. That's the Henderson Inclusion School and the Mary Lyons School. Those are our only 2 that offer that full continuum of services for students with special needs. We have other schools that are doing inclusion but do not offer that continuum of service. So if you think about it this way, and I always like to go by personal examples. So my daughter started at the Henderson Inclusion School, and it was only grade K0 to 5. So before my daughter went there, once students were leaving grade 5, they were going into substantially separate settings in grade 6. Because the district didn't have any inclusion programs for children with intellectual disabilities who were leaving the Henderson. So they defaulted and they went to substantially separate at Charlestown High School or, you know, in other middle schools. They went to the Harbor School, and before that, I forget what its name was, but that's basically the way that it went. So when my daughter went there, you know, being an attorney, that does help at times. is that I said she's entitled to the same inclusion placement that she has currently. So we work with the district. It was a very difficult, long, and prolonged battle, but the Henderson now goes from K0 to K22. We need to replicate our successes across the district, and we haven't done a good job of doing that. We have pockets of inclusion being done very well, but we don't offer that continuum of services across all grade levels. And it's an incredible disservice to children, and what a message it sends to say, okay, you know, you can be with your non-disabled peers while you're young, but, you know, once you get older, you're going to have to go into a sped class, and you can't be with your non-disabled peers anymore. For some children, that's going to be appropriate. For other children, what it does, it makes them drop out of school.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. Mr. Tron.
Good evening.
Good evening.
According to your last slide on the presentation,
Yep.
you mentioned that we need to work together to help connect parents with available outside resources like the state resources. Do you mean that the school doesn't have any kind of outreach program, any kind of awareness programs for school staff, or between your organization and teachers and parents regarding these kind of resources?
No, they don't. So what we do at SpedPAC is we present presentations, and they include this type of a presentation, but we only reach a very limited number of our population. What schools know about is the 688 process, which is at least 2 years before a child exits school, you make a referral for them to enter the adult system. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to highlight and ask the district for better partnership on making families aware of resources that are available to their children from the time that they enter school to the time that they exit school. Special education is not the only service that's available to children with disabilities. There are a host of other services that they may be eligible for. But if parents don't know about those services, they're not going to apply and they're not going to access them. We need to focus more on helping, you know, when you think about an IEP, sort of who has direct access, that's sort of our special ed coordinators, you know, and our special education teachers and the members of our team. We need to do a better job ensuring that they know about available resources so they can facilitate communicating that to families. That's currently not happening. You know, it might be happening on a small percentage, but overall, no, not at all. Parents don't know about these services, and as SpedPAC, we can do monthly meetings and we can post videos on our website, but we don't have direct access to all the families in BPS. There's privacy laws that prevent that.
I see. The other question, just for my interest, you mentioned that we do need a cabinet level position with respect to this kind of, you know, this. I'm very interested, and as a matter of fact, I'm very much concerned about students with disabilities because my own situation as well.
Yes.
And I do take very serious these kind of concerns.
I just think we need to be more realistic in the district. I mean, ELL and special education are two very unique needs, and they need to have a voice at the table so that that voice is included in all decision-making processes.
Let me interject here. When you mention cabinet level, you mean at the superintendent table?
Correct.
I see.
Not
Thank
the
you.
mayor's table, no.
Thank you, Mr. Tron. Ms. Robinson.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I was a SPED parent some 35 years ago. And so partly I feel disheartened when I hear conversation about issues that we fought for 35 years ago still being fought for today. I was one of those parents who fought for and got an out-of-district placement. And at that time, the school my son was going to, 95% of the kids were coming from Boston and were being bused to Newton. And the director of that school then said, if Boston would give us one of their empty buildings, we could build this same program here. So basically, we're busing our kids to substantially separate programs because we can't develop them in district.
We can, we just haven't.
We haven't, true, we haven't. that's my big question, because it feels like inclusion programs, when done right and for the right students, can benefit all. And so the question is why, what will it take in terms of our work together to begin to really look at how we create the best of inclusion within just about all of our schools?
So what I would say is that, as someone that's been in this role for a decade, is that there's never been a strategic plan to move things forward. We always are dealing with the current annual budget, the current cuts, the current priorities. I am glad that finally there's a master facilities plan that has evolved into the new name of Build BPS. It's been about 10 years for that. But it really does require sort of forward thinking. It's like, well, how do we stop spending $20, $30 million on out-of-district placements? I can tell you how to do it, you've just never done it. So you can't complain about the cost when you haven't done anything to change it. And so, I'm hopeful that, we'll continue to push forward, and that the people that follow me will continue to push. But in a lot of respects, it does feel like Groundhog Day. A lot of the issues that I brought up, when Dr. Johnson was here are the same issues that I'm bringing up today. The issue is because, and this certainly has nothing to do with any one superintendent, any sped director or any particular thing. It's been a culture that's existed in BPS for probably up to 20 years at this point, where special education was never considered a priority. So when and then SpedPAC didn't have an active role, and then it was activated by Jack Sinnott and other people that preceded me. And then the issue is that we had to spend so much time, attention, and resources dealing with issues where we were out of compliance and could have resulted in federal lawsuits, that became the focus. So you really can't look forward when you're spending so much time looking backward and trying to fix what's currently wrong. We're basically paying for the sins of the past, and we have been during my entire tenure. And there's been no meaningful investment beyond that $1 million for transition services, which basically was a token amount, right? We're, over $1 billion school system. $1 million bucks, I'm sorry, but, that's not a lot of money. And so, we spent so much time trying to deal with all of the problems of the past that there was no opportunity, and more importantly, there were no resources to invest in doing things differently. I'm hoping that now that we're in a better place, that can finally happen. Whether or not it does remains to be seen.
I think I have this question to you, Mr. Chair, in terms of, as we're thinking about, we're about to start afresh with the new superintendent. We're in the middle of Bill BPS. These issues have come before us in the past. How do we begin to have a different conversation, create a strategic plan, so that we're not just basically building a budget, but we're really thinking about how do we go forward and make these critical changes too, because these also are part of opportunity and achievement gaps.
And I'm sorry, which specific changes are you referring to?
The issue around beginning to look at creating a different strategy around special education. In terms of thinking about the monies that are going out, in terms of busing. So it said, as we're building new schools, as we're thinking about grade configurations, as we're thinking about where the placement of particular programs are, how do we begin to build a conversation so that we are not trying to Band-Aid a problem that was created in one other way, but that really is a strategic plan around stepping back and creating a district that really works for the students and the families that we have?
Well, I think we'll probably talk about it quite a bit this evening when we talk about Build BPS, because I think an underpinning of, and I appreciate you, weaving the two together, an underpinning of that approach is trying to unlock resources that are currently bound up in the way in which our district is organized, because our district is organized in an inefficient way. And so if we're able to more efficiently assign students across the district and provide more consistent funding that goes along with those students across the district, decrease transitions, and provide the opportunities for students to have a more consistent experience across the district, create more high-quality options closer to home. As a result of that, you will see a gradual release of the resources that we spend on things like busing and repetitive spend on things like administrative costs that can then be reinvested into the classrooms. And when we say reinvested in the classrooms and providing that more consistent approach and experience for our students, what we really mean is providing the programs that our neediest students need. I think a lot of the work that the district's done around the idea of long-term financial planning has laid the groundwork for this. But we need the resources to be able to operationalize those investments. And so I think, the points that Ms. Kane makes with respect to the way in which we need to make better use of the resources that we have, we have a pathway to do that, but we have to execute on it. And that takes time, and that also takes new funding sources as well, which is why, we even earlier this evening talked a little bit about the legislative strategy. So this is work that we're all urgently, I think, interested in. This is the work of closing opportunity and achievement gaps that is at the forefront of the strategic plan that this committee, under Mr. O'Neill's leadership, committed to in 2015. And it's going to continue to be the driving force for us in figuring out how we provide the best and most consistent opportunities for academic excellence for students all across the city.
Thank you.
I think that's telling that, Superintendent Perel has pointed out in the Bill BPS that the majority of our students with disabilities are in 5 of our underperforming high schools.
Yeah, exactly.
That speaks volumes about the priority.
And just to pick up on that theme, and thank you, Carolyn, both for your comments, but also Ms. Robinson, just to connect the dots. So when we think about Build BPS, but then think about the broader question of proactive planning that Ms. Kane has pointed out, I think there are two big elements, depending on how you count them. One of them is structure, and one of them is programming and instruction. So on the structural part, there is a central proactive tenet of Build BPS that is looking at equity of program placement, looking at feeder patterns, looking at pathways, looking at literally whether or not we have the footprint in the right grade levels to put our most vulnerable learners, both our English learners and our students with disabilities, and their program placement in the forefront of our planning. That means following them all the way up through a K-12 pathway. So that is a principal tenet of Build BPS on the structural side. That is only a piece of the puzzle. And I think both Ms. Kane, but also internal conversations with Cindy Nielsen and Dr. Granson are pointing in the direction which I believe the new leadership coming in should view as an important priority, which is to look at that proactive planning. I heard very clearly what Ms. Kane said about now that the district is in a better place, not a perfect place, but a better place in some of the truly dramatic compliance crises that she and others have experienced, and many of you know well. This is an appropriate time to look at the quality of that programming, and also to look at new placements for some of those programs. So I do think that Build BPS has opened the structural question, and internally and with the collaboration of families, teachers, and educators, there's an equally important conversation to have about programming and proactive planning around the instructional experience at the same time. But a big part of that conversation, I think, has been called front and center through Build BPS, which I think is truly important. And I hope that the district continues to drive through that door.
Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Dr. Coleman.
Thank you, Ms. Kane. You are an exceptional model of engaged citizen using data and time to really drive us to get better. I just thank you, and I always learn whenever I get an opportunity to listen to you, and thank you for all you've shared and helped make me a better informed school committee member. So I have a couple questions that I'd love your perspective on. The one is, because of the work you're engaged in, you deal with one of our big challenges as a district in terms of respecting the autonomy of schools and providing central services. So this whole tension between what needs to be centralized and driven from a district level, while we're also seeing that some of our greatest successes occur in schools like the Henderson, that we provide resources and support for autonomy. So as you, I hope, finish your 11th year, take a sabbatical, and then come back to engage us in a different way.
I'm not going to be Mrs. Mudd. You're not getting me for a lifetime.
I would expect you to find alternate models to do this differently. What kind of wisdom would you share with us about how you've seen us struggle with this for a decade? As you think about that balance between autonomy and centrally, what would you recommend for us to rethink in order to do that balance better or eliminate it?
I think a lot of things need to be rethought in this district, and I think that autonomy can be a wonderful thing, except what's happened in our district, it has produced no consistency. And I think that autonomy has been well served in some schools, and it's been abused by other schools. And we've created this, disjointed system in BPS where, first of all, and I don't mean to understate the challenges that we face. We're losing kids to exam schools, to charter schools, to private schools as they get older. And our most vulnerable students aren't going anywhere because they have nowhere else to go. But when we talk about autonomies of school, where is the accountability is my question. And how are they being held to the same accountable standards that all of the other schools are being held to? If you have a child that changes schools, you can have them going from one type of a math program to a completely other math program. It's like, are you in the same district? What's going on? So I think that the whole issue of autonomy needs to have an overview and looked at, because when it starts to impact students negatively, then autonomy is no longer what it's intended to be. It's intended to let people do the best job possible without interference. But that's not the way that it's played out in BPS throughout the years. It's given people now we have issues where, the majority of our high schools, if they're not exam and they're not charter and they're not private, then they, you got the whole host of them that have all these different entrance requirements. And while they're not intended to be discriminatory, their impact is discriminatory because kids with special needs can't meet those entrance requirements, even if it's something as simple as doing an entrance essay for it. They start out later and they don't get the support to do it. They're viewed on different tracks, kids with general education and kids with special education. Like, one of the things that I think is extremely troubling is that we do a lot to prepare our middle and high schoolers for later on in life, through school counselors, and they do like career searches, and but if you're SPED, you're considered the responsibility of the SPED department. You don't get equal access to that same opportunity. And I think that some of the schools that have autonomy are misusing it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, there needs to be, it shouldn't be once you get the autonomy, it's yours forever. It should be, are you doing the following things, and are you meeting the following objectives, and are you ensuring equal access to opportunity for all students? And if not, we're going to take it back. Mm-hmm. And I think that too often in BPS, a decision is made, and then good, bad, or indifferent, it's never revisited. And that's just not the way you run the railroad.
Thank you. My other question, in the context of a system of choice, is that a system that could ever serve special, atypically development children well, when we don't have the ability to kind of focus on where people live and bring them forward in a systematic way?
Well, I think there's two issues, right? So we have high incidence disabilities and low incidence disabilities. So for high incidence disabilities, like specific learning disability, you should be able to be served in any school throughout BPS. And then as you get, more into the autism, intellectual disabilities, it may not be every school in the district, but it should be at least 3 to 4 choices, right? And they should be geographically, not an hour away, as we heard earlier, from your school, right? So I think that the issue is that we do have programs, but we certainly never implemented the special education overlay from the External Advisory Committee. That was basically dead on day one, right? So the issue is, what are we doing to make sure that there's sufficient opportunities to allow for choice? It may not be the same number of choice as general education parents, but it should be choice. And 3 or more is a choice, And quite honestly, when you go to your IEP meeting and there's the issue of placement, parents are supposed to be provided with the opportunity to go and observe those programs before they choose. So if the law is working the way that it's supposed to, choice is part of it. And certainly what you can say is, which was mine, I entered BPS and they offered me a placement for my child, and I went and observed, and I said, absolutely not. And they said, then sue us. And I said, okay. So we did, So I hope that choice is more available now than it was 15 years ago. And I strongly do get the sense that that's what it is. There's not going to be open seats in every program across the district. That's just not reality. But as you recognize that there's not enough choice, then you work to create additional programs to meet that need.
So I have one more question. I'm not sure exactly how to, I hope I can say this right. So in your experience, as you look around both districts and others, are there models of success that you've seen that we should look at more carefully, that you would recommend that we, as we build a strategic plan around really getting at these intractable or historically intractable problems, that we should consider?
Yeah, particularly in the higher grade levels, high schools and even middle school. BPS does not have a lot of experience in those areas. So I know that when we were looking to expand the Henderson, we asked a group of people to go out, including central office at Newton North, which has a very good inclusion program that includes high school students. You can want to do something, but you need to know how to do something. And that experience doesn't exist across the district. And quite honestly, the difference is there too, is that it's not seen as special ed and general ed. It's seen as one school that's completely integrated and that offers all those different opportunities. And quite honestly, what a big part of it is too, is that I learned in being in inclusion, is that general education students benefit just as much as special education students, and it makes them better people. It teaches them life's lessons before they leave a school district that they can carry with them for the rest of their lifetime. That's one of the things about being inclusion, is that, I go to the hairdresser and she has a picture of my daughter. And she's like, I can't tell you how many kids come in and say, that's Mary Kane. If Mary was in a substantially separate class with only kids with disabilities, the kids in her community wouldn't know who she is. And so we do that better at the earlier grades. We don't do it well at all at the middle and high school grades, and that really needs to be a focus. Because what we see is that a lot of kids that don't have the level of need that my child has, they become disenfranchised, and then they drop out, and then they're on the pipeline to prison in one way or another. Even unintentionally, they're doing things that they don't know are wrong, either online or, on in chat rooms, and it ends up being criminal type behavior that gets them into a world of trouble.
To your point, I don't know if you heard the story about the young gentleman who gave his life in North Carolina.
I did.
And that early on, he had the opportunity to engage with his atypically developing peers, and that was fundamental to a sense of service and commitment. So it really is it was a moving story for me. Well, I want to thank you for your service and hope that you don't stop it and compete with Mr. Mudd.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Mr. O'Neill.
So thank you, Ms. Kane. And just for the record, I don't think Mr. Mudd ever actually took a year sabbatical between being advocate and advocate emeritus, so there'll be no sabbatical allowed.
I also don't have Mr. Mudd's stamina, so forget
exactly. So, Ms. Kane, we've known each other a long time, and whenever I get tired about the amount of hours that I volunteer for BPS, I draw inspiration from you.
Thank you.
And what you have done for this district has been incredible. Like my colleagues, I learn every single time I talk to you. We've had many frank discussions over the years, but what I appreciate is that you don't sugarcoat things. You call it as you see it. You compliment when we're doing things right, but you hold our feet to the fire when we're doing things wrong. And you're always doing it to teach, teach, teach. So I've actually learned a lot from you over the years, believe it or not. So I do have a couple of quick questions for you. Oh, and I do want to make the point, I think you said, and I wrote down, we can't complain about the cost of out-of-district placements if we haven't done anything to address it. I do just want to point out respectfully that at the prodding of this committee and others, we are in the process of building a brand-new building for the Carter School, which will increase that number from 25 to 60. Many of those students who will come from out-of-district placements and come back into the city, which will be great for them. So, but I understand you're talking, yeah, that's one good thing, but we have a lot of others. There are many students that are in out-of-district placements that aren't at the needs that the Carter serves, so I understand the point that you're making. But I did want to say that there's at least one good thing going on there. So when you talk about 39, I think it was 39% of students. 36, thank you, that are insubstantially separate. And we do, as you rightfully pointed out, we do have a policy of this committee, as the chair said, and others, that specifically calls for increasing inclusive opportunities for our students. And we've been talking with the district the past few years about doing it the right way, not rushing it, and I know you've been involved in those discussions. But what is the right goal for us to shoot for? If we're at 36,
So it's not a number,
ultimate goal?
right? It's not a number, it's a process. So under the law, every child has an annual IEP meeting, and then every 3 years, they have a 3-year reevaluation IEP meeting. Every year that the team meets, they should be looking at, is this child being provided with as many opportunities as possible in the least restrictive environment, even if we have to bring in additional supports and services to make that successful. So for some kids, depending on their needs, you would look at unstructured times, recess, lunch, social interaction, right? Other students, it's specials, it's art, it's music, it's things that are less academically taxing. But children need to be included in the life of the school. And kids in substantially separate programs are considered separate. They're the SPED kids. They're not part of the school community. And looking at ways to integrate them in a meaningful way. And one of the things is letting their peers get to know who they are and seeing them, and quite honestly, becoming less fearful. A lot of kids fear disability because they don't know anything about it, you know? And once they do get to know about it, what I've seen at the Henderson and what I've always felt is one of the most magical things about that environment is that my daughter's non-disabled peers embrace the opportunities to be leaders, embrace the opportunity to nurture her. And I will say that some of her best teachers in her life have been her fellow students because they embraced that and it changed them for a lifetime. Now, you know, they still love my child, and I think they love a lot more children having known my child.
And I think back to when we were debating the inclusion policy and students who testified about, you know, disabled and non-disabled students who testified, both from the Henderson and from the Mary Lyon School as well. And, you know, were eye-opening in what they were teaching us about the value that they saw, both general ed students and students with disabilities, about being in an inclusive setting. So the more we can push that, and thank you for making us think about the culture of the district and around school leaders and around autonomy, and I agree with everything that you were saying there. Also, you talked about a kind of a third rail issue as well, the amount of students who are on IEP. And in fact, are all the students who are on one, should they be on one? And that's a difficult topic. We have, as a committee, asked questions about special ed department, which they provide us additional information tonight. Thank you for that, by the way, about the specific disabilities and the racial and socioeconomic breakdown of that. And are there disparities there that we should be concerned about and looking at? And
I think so. I think it's the issue of, you know, just because a child presents with a behavioral issue or an emotional issue doesn't mean they have a disability that requires special education services. They might require some specific type of interventions, or maybe they didn't have exposure to early literacy. It doesn't mean that, you know, because you're not on the same level as your peers, academically, emotionally, and behaviorally, that you need to go onto an IEP. And for a lot of kids, that has always meant going into a separate classroom, right? It's deal with the kids that are in your class, right? And when I hear about kids that are getting suspended or, you know, for periods of time that are 5 and 6 years old, it's like, what? You know? I mean, those are children. Those are young children. Why aren't we meeting the child where they are and identifying what their need is and addressing their need and just saying, well, I don't want to deal with you. You have to go, you're going to go over to SPED. It's supposed to be a tiered intervention approach,
Yep.
which is what do they need? Try certain interventions. If they don't work, increase them. And then, you know, after several attempts, then it might be a referral. But in BPS, like I said, it's always been one or the other. And that needs to change if the district wants to change the percentage of kids in special education. And I really think it needs to, because we're doing a disservice to those children that may not need special education services, but we've stamped them with that mark because we didn't feel like dealing with what their current issues are.
And this is a difficult subject to bring up as well, and I do suspect it's a very small percent, but I've also been told by enough folks that believe it does exist. What about parents who push to have a student on an IEP for whatever reason, even if the student really doesn't need it, if it is some other issues that you've raised?
Well, I would think that's a very small percentage. Frankly, I'm in a club that nobody looks to join. The issue of, you know, it might be more of a misunderstanding in what they've heard through other parents is if you need more services, you have to get an IEP. So again, it's a communication piece and a misinformation. You shouldn't have to have an IEP to get more support. It's the nature of that support and why you need that support. Is it the impact of a disability, or are you just going through a tough time?
Yeah.
Or maybe something's gone on that requires something right now. But you don't want to set children on an educational trajectory of being on an IEP if it's not what they really need.
And thank you. And continuing, my final question is, because you are so good at giving us advice on key issues that we're discussing, and you mentioned your daughter Mary is turning
20.
20.
I know, hard to believe because I'm only 25. But
I know, right. But we provide services up to 22.
Correct.
Correct? So she has a couple more years.
Yes, I'm not saying her mother does.
Okay. But I'm interested specifically in your advice around that 22-year issue, because this district is one of 4 states in the country, I believe, that educate students or provide services up to the age of 22. And it has been a hard and fast rule based on a policy of this committee that it's when a student turns 22. And yet we heard earlier this year about people that are focused on should a student be able to graduate with a class at the end of this year. But as you have taught us, if we provide a service for one, we have to provide a service for all.
Right.
Is that
So
correct?
3 up to the age of 22, it's only for special education. It's not for other students. So at some point, the district needs to reflect on what is general education and what is adult education, quite frankly, okay? Special education, it only exists for 3 and 4-year-olds if you have special needs, okay? There's no requirement on the district to service 3 and 4-year-olds that don't have special needs. The same goes up to age 22. That's for students with special needs. Now, I realize that we're a very diverse district with very diverse needs, and we provide opportunities that people that are coming into the district at different points in their lives, from different countries, from different opportunities. But there's a difference between special education and extending general education for a policy reason. And I don't think that that was understood very well from my perspective, from what I saw. But obviously, if you're going to allow students to, general education students, to stay past their 22nd birthday till the end of the school year, then absolutely I'm going to demand the same thing for students with special education needs, because that age was built for them. It wasn't built for others. And if the district chooses to expand that, go right ahead. But I think we have a problem paying the bills we currently have and enhancing and, improving the things that are currently on our plate before I would start to add more things to my plate. You have to make a distinction about what you get served and where you get served. That doesn't mean that you deny people an opportunity to better themselves and to get a diploma. It just means you do it through a different mechanism. If you want to start to expand education to include higher ages, that's a slippery slope that I wouldn't want to go down for fiscal reasons, you know? And that's why we have adult education programs. It's not the same as special education.
Thank you, Ms. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Vice Chair Oliver Davila.
Thank you, Chair. I missed you so much.
I miss you too, Alex. We spent so much time together.
It feels so lost not seeing you all the time. Thank you so much for the search committee service and then for all of these years of service. Just, that blows me away, so really thank you. And I agree with all your points. I could not agree with you more on the culture shift. And so when we talk about money, I don't think culture shift has anything to do with dollars. So similarly, I feel that way about how we look at ELL students and also how we look at family engagement. Those things, family engagement, we can say, you know, there's some money that can be put forth, but really what you're saying is that it's every single person who is part of this district, who works in this district. It's our responsibility to work with all students. And so I could not agree with you more. And I could not agree with you more on the other piece around the cabinet level. That is also something that does not have a cost. I do think it's important to elevate those departments, those positions. When we look at the number of students we have that are ELL and SPED, that to me it's like a no-brainer, so I could not agree more. I also, and I don't know if I understand very well, but in terms of the partnerships, I don't think that also costs money for us to figure out how we better partner with some of the partners that you talked about. And so I wonder if we can think about, like, in the partnerships department, like how does that happen? How do we just have better partnerships with some of the places that you mentioned?
Well, obviously, through my professional capacity, I've learned more about state services, but I'll be honest with you, like, I navigated it on my own as a parent. And, you know, like, I didn't know about Mass Health initially, and then a parent told me about DDS services. And so it's an issue of you don't know what you don't know,
Right.
and that goes on throughout your child's life, what you continue to learn. And I just think we need to do a better job than expecting parent-to-parent information to carry the day,
Right.
particularly for our more vulnerable students in more challenged families in terms of parents don't have access to information. So, I mean, I'm not asking people to do the job for them, but just facilitate getting them information. What I will tell you is that on the Autism Commission's website, we have brochures for families that talk about a host of state services, and they're already translated in 6 different languages. So that's readily available, but I can't get it to people the way that BPS could.
Right.
So it's really asking to help promote what exists and help to promote that information, because, you know, DDS has 44 family support centers throughout the state. You don't have to be deemed eligible for DDS services in order to access those services. There's 7 autism support centers across the state where parents can go for workshops, for activities, and most importantly, to network with other families and not feel so isolated and alone. And it's all free.
Right.
But, you know, as I learn about things, I'm very anxious and very motivated to share that information, but my capacity to do so is limited because there's privacy issues and we only have access to a certain number of emails and contacts. But what I'm saying is we all collectively need to do a better job, because it's not just special education, right? And you want to create the most set of robust services that are wraparound for that child 24/7 as they're possibly eligible for. You know, different eligibility requirements exist for different state agencies. But if you don't know that it's available, you're not going to apply, and you're certainly never going to get access to it. You know, there's the Autism Waiver Program from 0 to 8. There's the DDS DESI program for 6 up to 22. You know, there's the PREETS program for mass rehab. It's like, I don't think our parents know that these programs exist, and quite frankly, they need them the most.
And so I don't see, I think that you're, again, for your service, for wanting to share that, and it's not your responsibility, it's the district's responsibility. So I guess, and my question is not necessarily towards you, but as we sit here and you mentioned, strategic plans, how do we better partner? How are those partnerships true and real, accessible, and that information flows down? So I think that's something that when we continue to have these discussions, like, we need to keep bringing that up. And the only reason I said the partnership office, only because we have a partnership office, so I think just really making sure that we step up. I have two more questions, and one of them is around the identification. So I profess that this is not something I know a lot about, and I'm wondering, in the over-identification, how do parents navigate that? So, for example, when my daughter was in preschool, I had, a few teachers that were concerned about her, and we had a meeting, and they were saying that she might be autistic, and it was very unexpected to me, and I remember feeling like, that's not true, that's not possible, and just feeling like really overwhelmed. I can imagine how families feel. And I have resources, I speak English, and it was really a really challenging time during those years of preschool. We ended up working together. I had my daughter go see her doctor, and she did not have autism. But anyway, my example is because when I think of a parent who maybe doesn't have as many resources, or maybe doesn't speak English, has a lot of other barriers, what is the role of parents, and how can they navigate if their child is identified, and in that process, like, how do parents have a voice to push back? As you said, some students are identified that shouldn't be there. And so I'm just wondering, like, how that process works, because I don't know.
Well, so the process itself is that the parent has to consent to evaluations, and then that sort of process begins. But what we do as SpedPAC is that we give workshops, right, on IEP basic rights, sort of understanding the process. But again, we're only able to reach a percentage of our population. I probably, I don't know, it varies week to week, but parents reach out to us directly. And so some of the SpedPAC board members might answer them by email or by phone, or if it's a little bit more complicated, they'll ask me to respond. So it's really, just sharing information and letting them know what questions they can ask, and let them know what their rights are. But also pointing them out to that it's not just district evaluations that you can access. You can go to your pediatrician, ask for a referral. Certainly even doesn't matter if you have private insurance or Mass Health, but sort of how to navigate that process. And then even, we help them with resources if they're having difficulty with the insurance company, what to do. But it's a very individual journey, you know what I mean? So, and there's a lot of culturally and linguistic barriers that come into play depending on the culture of the family. I know that I went years ago to like a Vietnamese Christmas thing for kids with autism, and it was very challenging because the way that the culture viewed the diagnosis of autism was actually creating an impediment for families in accessing services. So you try to dismantle and break down those barriers when you find out about them, but it really, it's hard to do on a large scale. So helping our special education teachers and our IEP teams be more culturally sensitive. I mean, someone not making eye contact might not be a sign of autism. It might actually be a cultural issue, because in the culture it's, you don't make eye contact. So those types of things. But so education, both for parents and for staff, helps, because you want to divert going to special education wherever possible. So, and I would say that information and education is the best way to approach it.
Thank you. That was going to be like my question. Is like, I know when Cindy presented, she talked about some of the percentage going down based on like staff training. So I was just wondering what else we could do, because that is daunting for, just having been through only a blip of it, I can only imagine.
Yeah, and we've made progress in that area, but again, we're still trying to deal with the die that was cast years
Yeah.
before us, right?
Correct.
So,
Yep.
and the issue is that on the go forward, like the people that are here now won't be here in 5 or 10 years, you know what I mean? So what are we doing to create systems in place so that there's a tiered intervention system versus one or the other? Because some people are gonna be more trained in how to do that effectively than others. And again, it's more of a district-wide plan versus pockets of excellence.
And then my last question is, again, I profess my ignorance. I am learning a lot, and I learned a lot tonight, is one of the comments you made was that some staff may say, oh, I need a co-teacher. So I wonder if, we're in this like really rich resource city of Boston with all these colleges and universities, and how can we better get those institutions to meet our needs? So when a teacher comes out, that they would be ELL and SPED certified, would that make a difference in terms of like starting to, change the culture and having staff that can work with all students? Do you think that would make?
Well, we have a lot of teachers that are dual and even triple certified at this point. But I guess my point is saying is that, special education, and it's quoted throughout case law, is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we have different children with different needs in different classrooms at different grade levels in different schools across the district. And when I hear, and obviously I don't want to get into collective bargaining issues, but, and when I hear about, well, co-teaching is what we all need, it's like, no, you think that's what you need because you've heard about it and that it was really good. But why isn't it that we're approaching it with what are the current needs and what needs to happen in this particular classroom for these particular children? And then if that doesn't work, then we revisit it. And, whether it's a teacher and a para, if it's a dual certified teacher, it really does depend on the unique needs of those children. And I just hate to see like people saying, well, this is just the way to do it. Because quite frankly, co-teaching in every classroom for children with special needs is not sustainable in this district. And it really needs to be looked at on what's needed, where it's needed, and when it's needed. And it just isn't this broad brush stroke about this is the way to do it. And I think that co-teaching can be very effective, but I also think that a lot of adults underestimate the challenge of effective co-teaching. Teachers like to run their own classroom, and when you all of a sudden have to be, the co-captain, it's a very different role. So it's not as easily done as some people might think it is. But more importantly, if you want to provide children with the supports they need in order for them to be successful, but you don't want to overly support them and, enable helplessness either at any you know what I mean? So it's a very difficult balance, and, the law requires that it's an individualized education plan. And it's, and it's supposed to be based on the unique needs of that child. And all of our children are different, even children that carry the same diagnosis. And so we really need to be having that individualized approach to services as well as placement.
Great. And I really appreciate your comments around autonomy and accountability. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Ms. Kane, you're well past your 3 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight and educating us on the work that the SPED PAC does and the work that you've done with our special education department as well as just across the schools over the years. And I really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to highlight the work that the members of the special education department do on behalf of our children, because I think it's often unsung, and we've taken special care when Ms. Nielsen presented a few weeks ago to do the same, because we do as a committee and as a district greatly appreciate the contributions they make on behalf of our children. I know you don't do it, any of this work for the personal adulation, but you certainly heard plenty of that from my colleagues tonight. But I certainly do appreciate once again the fact that you keep us focused on issues like transitions, inclusion, And really, you know, as my colleague Vice Chair Oliver Davila mentioned, ensuring that accountability and autonomy go hand in hand, and that's not just limited to things like innovation. It's just the nuts and bolts of the work that we do for all students in this district every day. So I don't have any further questions for you. It's been a pleasure listening to everything that my colleagues have spoken with you about this evening, and we want to thank you for your continued partnership and look forward to continuing to work ahead.
Thank you. We do have a number of issues to follow up on, but I've been in contact with the district, so I'll leave those for another day. Thank you.
And
We know you
hope-
know how to find us.
And we also hope you had a great celebration of your anniversary.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Well, thank you again to Ms. Kane and to the SpedPAC group. We'll move on now to our second and final report this evening, which is a Build BPS update on the grade reconfiguration strategy for the district. At this time, I'd like to invite forward the following people to provide a presentation. Mary Driscoll, our Associate Superintendent, Charles Granson, our Chief Academic Officer, and Mr. Nate Cooter, our Deputy Chief Financial Officer. As they're approaching the podium, I'll ask our interim superintendent for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto. Tonight, we are providing the first of two presentations this month that will provide the school committee and the public with a thorough update on recent planning activities related to the Build BPS Educational and Facilities Master Plan. And so we are excited to bring forth at the next meeting on May 22nd a series of action recommendations related to the high school planning process connected to the McCormick, as well as the potential addition of 6th grades at a number of schools, both connected to the McCormick and also citywide. Tonight, we're beginning with more details on the overall transition toward a district with two primary pathways for students and families, K-6, 7 to 12, and K-8, 9 to 12. And these twin grade configuration models for the district as a core pillar of the Build BPS framework. We will ask that the school committee consider formally endorsing and adopting these two primary grade configurations as the preferred model for BPS. So tonight's presentation will discuss the Build BPS proposal around grade configurations at the high level. So not any specifics tonight, but the general concept of these dual primary pathways, the rationale behind changing grade configurations in Boston Public Schools, and a vision for moving toward greater coherence in grade configurations across BPS. The overall movement of the district toward fewer grade configurations is designed to reduce transitions for students and families, improve equity, and increase opportunity for our students, particularly our most vulnerable learners, and we will return to discussions of students with special needs and English learners, both in specialized programs. And finally, to grow toward ensuring more school communities with sustainable enrollment and budgets. I would, however, like to be explicitly clear that while we believe these grade configurations are the best predominant fit for our district, due both to demographics, family choice, and physical footprint, there is no one-size-fits-all model that is best for all schools, and particularly not given the diversity of Boston's landscape. So while there is no perfect strategy in a district as complex as ours, this basic model of preferred routes nonetheless will clarify the basis for which future decisions are made and ensure greater equity and consistency across our district. We do plan to come back to this body on May 22nd with a set of related but much more specific proposals. We are very excited to bring forward at the next meeting some of the first sort of proactive planning and new opportunities that a number of our schools can and will be engaged in. but we will discuss the impact of many schools, particularly those that feed the McCormick Middle School, expanding from K-5 to K-6, along with others in the area of the city. But for tonight's presentation, at the macro level around this predominant dual pathway strategy, again, both with an eye toward reducing transitions. I'll turn things over to Nate Cooter, our Deputy Chief Financial Officer, Charles Granson, Chief Academic Officer, and Mary Driscoll, Associate Superintendent of Elementary and Middle Schools, in addition to their leadership roles in each of their respective positions. They are also key members and active participants and real leaders of the Build BPS planning process. So my thanks to you all.
Thank you, Interim Superintendent Perel, and thank you, school committee members. We're excited to be before you tonight, and you'll be seeing quite a bit of us over the next couple of weeks, as Laura indicated. Tonight's presentation, though, we're at that 30,000-foot view, so we'll be highlighting how the conversation about this K-6, 712, K-8, 912 pathway has been embedded throughout the Build BPS process. We see this as a natural next step that as we get ready to make recommendations about specific scenarios, we want to first just kind of codify the overall strategy that's built into Build BPS. In the fall, in our update, we highlighted 4 key goals of the plan, and this presentation focuses mainly on the 4th goal, as Superintendent Perel already highlighted, the idea that we want to achieve fewer transitions for students and families by creating more K-6 schools and more 7 to 12 that would allow a single articulation, just as the existing K-8, 912s already do for many of our families. This slide is probably becoming familiar to you by now. This is the slide we refer to as our fact base. And this outlines the crucial challenges that community, district, and planning team face, not just with facilities, but with enrollment, options for students, with equity, and even school effectiveness. And I think many of the things we heard Caroline talk about in the previous presentation about access for students with disabilities and the kind of choices that families have are wrapped up or captured in this fact base. These are the 8 key facts that sort of undergird our Build BPS plan. So tonight, we're going to put a specific proposal in front of you about codifying this idea of K-6, 712, K-8, 912. To help you think about that, we're going to offer you a rationale for why it's better for students, why it's better for school communities, what we've heard from community feedback that has led us to and supported us making this proposal, and then more details in the plan, our plan for implementing it. So over the next 10 years of Build BPS, our reconfigurations and major construction projects will be primarily focused on creating one of these 2 pathways, either a K-6, 712 pathway or a K-8, 912 pathway. This is not a signal, and I want to reiterate what Laura already said, this is not a signal that we're moving away, for instance, from our EECs, which serve our youngest learners generally in a K0 through 1 or K0 through 2 pathway. And we also recognize that we have some K5, K612 pathways that already exist, such as at the Quincy, upper and lower, that will not go away because we're saying that this is our primary grade configuration. These will continue to exist in the foreseeable future, but we also want to reiterate that any changes that we're making for schools around their grade configurations are being done in partnership with those schools.
We want to start the discussion tonight around the rationale with the student experience and how grade configurations benefit students first. We know that the most important factor in student achievement is grade instruction. The work our teachers do day in and day out is by far the most important thing and what makes BPS great. However, our vision for Build BPS is to help remove some of the structural and environmental issues that impede learning. And while changing grade spans will obviously never be as important as grade instruction, we feel that it can help benefit student learning, help increase the likelihood of graduation, and therefore we should really begin the hard work of making these changes to grade configurations over the next several years. At the end of last November, we published the Build BPS Phase 2 report, and in it highlighted the need to reduce transitions to benefit students. The proposed plan will minimize the number of transitions that the majority of BPS students experience during their academic career by reconfiguring schools primarily to a K-6, 7-12, and a K-8, 9-12 school district. Throughout our Build BPS engagement, families have articulated a desire for fewer transitions and more predictable pathways for their children. And this is backed up by the research on grade configurations and transitions. Each time a student moves from one school to another, there's a risk of relationships and learning being disrupted. That's what we're trying to change and what our focus is. The next slide shows our current configurations and how complex the existing BPS portfolio is, simply by examining the number of grade configurations that are present. So this landscape is difficult for our parents to navigate because there are unclear pathways for our students as they progress from kindergarten through graduation. At various points over the last few years, you've heard us refer to the number of grade configurations, and the numbers range from 23 to 15. The primary reason for that has to do with how we classify and categorize the last category on this slide, which is special population schools such as Boston Adult Technical Academy, the McKinley schools, or schools like the Carter School. What we're trying to highlight tonight in this presentation is for the majority of our students, there's not a clear pathway. And we know that these clear pathways are even more overwhelming for families who are working with children who have the highest needs, both our English learners and special education students. And finally, I want to point out just on this slide that we are proposing a predominant model that already exists within BPS, as there are 9 schools that are either 6 through 12 or 7 through 12 that are already in our district as part of our pathways. This next chart shows the number and percentage of students who are enrolled in the different configurations by grade level. You'll notice that 45% of our elementary school age students are currently enrolled in a K-5 elementary school. Other students attend a school that ends before grade 3, which is included in the other category of that elementary bucket. When we combine these two groups, 52% of BPS elementary students attend schools that end at or before grade 5. At the other end, 7-12 and 6-12 high schools are established model within BPS, as I mentioned. The 9 schools in our district serve 27% of our middle grade students, with the majority of that group, 17% of them, being served in our current 7-12 high schools. This is really a bigger percentage of the individual grades when you consider that 17% of 6th through 8th graders are served in a 7-12, and none of them are in 6th grade, which means that 7th grade and 8th grade students in those 7-12s represent a high percentage, almost 25% of those individual grade spans. Well, you'll notice that with 45% of our students in K-5s and only 10% of our students in 6 through 12 high schools, we have a system that is currently designed to generate more transitions in the years where we know transitions have the worst effect on our students. Not surprisingly, the result of this mismatch of capacity is multiple transitions for students. Over the last 3 years, 1 in 6 BPS 7th grader attended 3 different schools for 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. As part of our equity review on our current configurations, we wanted to understand the impact on traditionally marginalized populations. Unfortunately, the current number of school transitions disproportionately impacts traditionally marginalized students. White students in BPS are the least likely to attend schools in a pathway that requires multiple transitions before high school. There is also a difference when we look at income. 47% of our economically disadvantaged students are attending K-8 schools, whereas 60% of our non-economically disadvantaged students are in K-8 schools. We don't see a difference in enrollment for English learners and special education students, but we know that the highest need students are the most likely to benefit when we reduce transitions for all students. And as we begin this transition on a larger scale, it will be important for us to continue to apply an equity lens to our implementation plans. In the meantime, we know that those with privilege find a way to navigate the system in a way that the others cannot. Before I transition to talk about the impact on school communities, we wanted to lay out a clearer picture of what the district could look like in the next decade or beyond. Unlike the muddled picture that I laid out on an earlier slide, without clear pathways for families in every community, we are talking about reducing this so that not only is there a reduced number of grade configurations, but schools in specific communities know how they are aligned and know when they will transition to into the when they will transition in their K-12 pathway. Rather than a mismatch of capacity and different configurations, we would have an aligned district that guarantees everyone this K-12 pathway, where they're only required to change schools once. This is far from a uniform landscape, as we've emphasized. We would continue to maintain multiple options, but the majority of our district would be in a K-6, 7, 12, or a K-8, 9 to 12 pathway. The numbers are here to give you the relative scale of what we anticipate in terms of the different pathways. And while we have a lot of work to do to engage with individual school communities, this shows how we plan to lay out the conversation with individual school communities. I'm going to transition now to talk about how reconfigurations benefit school communities. The first thing that we wanted to talk about on the next slide, coming off of a budget season in which we heard from many of our school communities about declining enrollment and the pain that they feel in terms of half-full classrooms or partially full classrooms, we wanted to address what some schools are experiencing either because of declining enrollment or because families are attempting to navigate our disjointed system. And I've had many conversations with school leaders of K-5s who will tell you that families start to leave their school in 3rd and 4th grade in an attempt to avoid the transition to a middle school or to transition to a single transition pathway. And these small losses in enrollment, even if they're 1 to 2 to 3 students at a single school, they can really add up across the system. A 1% decrease in how full our classrooms are, so the percentage of the classrooms that are full, just a 1% decrease amounts to between 2.1 and 3.4 million annually in lost WSF revenue to those schools. Our hope is that changing these configurations will help schools retain students and will help us reinvest in our schools. And even a small change, we think, could make a significant benefit for these schools. We can't talk about the transition, we can't talk about the loss in elementary enrollment of course, without acknowledging the role of charter schools and their impact on our enrollment. This table shows the grade a student was enrolled in BPS prior to transitioning to a charter school the following year, and the percentage of the overall cohort that we lose to charter schools that year. After the 4th grade and after 5th grade are 2 years where we see the highest percentage of students leaving BPS to attend our charter schools. And there are, the primary reason is there are multiple charter schools that span grades 5 through 12. And as a result, 12% of BPS 4th graders transition to charter schools for grade 5. But we have reason to believe that the 6th grade added on to the end of an elementary school may affect this trend. The loss of students to charter schools is 2 to 5% higher at K-5 schools than they are at our K-8 schools. So if the K-5 schools have this, if the K-6 schools that are reconfigured have the same turnover rate as their partner K-8 schools, then we should see a 1 to 2% increase in the fill rate of those schools, the equivalent of a $500,000 to $1 million investment in our elementary schools annually.
Good evening. As Nate mentioned, while the research supports less transitions being better for our kids, we wanted to provide an opportunity to discuss our continued commitment to robust academic programming regardless of configuration. We recognize that there's a lot of important work to do, and there's a lot underway. And in various forms, we've engaged a number of stakeholders throughout the organization. Together with Mary Driscoll and School Networks, we're looking at strategies to strengthen and support middle grade instruction. And we've formed both middle grades and 7 through 12 working groups. We've also made additional science investments, as you all are aware, in the FY20 budget, and held a session this past December with school leaders and science specialists in schools to look at what we need to do in terms of improving science instruction and ensuring that there's standards-aligned science instruction in schools. The Office of English Learners is coordinating the effort to understand the Look Act, and as we work with the ELL Task Force, looking at how we move towards the multicultural, multilingual Boston Public Schools, and so looking at the future of bilingual education and dual language programming in our across our district. We've heard feedback from school leaders throughout the school year about the importance of social emotional learning, particularly in these grades, and how critical it is to a young person's education, and the strong foundational work we have in our district as it relates to culturally and linguistically sustaining practices. I mean, we also heard the need for those things to be more aligned and to provide practical strategies, and so that is also a part of the work we're doing. The Office of Special Education, and in collaboration with the entire asset team, is beginning conversations around how we look at improving the quality of instruction in sub-separate environments, and so fully in support of much of what Carolyn King just presented, as we look towards providing more inclusive communities and moving towards the inclusion models in the district. We still can't wait in terms of improving the quality of instruction in sub-separate learning environments, and we continue to do that with a focus on providing equal access to standards-aligned and essentials-informed instruction, as well as providing access to high-quality curriculum. This is just a sort of preview to a lot of the work, again, that we've been doing. We look forward to providing more information on this in our asset review presentation coming this June, and really excited also about all discussions about strategic plans around education, whether it be special education or instruction broadly. Okay, in this section, we're going to take the opportunity to reflect on community feedback in the process. When we presented to you after we released the updated report last December, we summarized the themes of the reaction from the community. Not only was there positive response to our desire to add more K-6 expansion, but the community has been urging us to move more and quickly on this. It is in reaction to this feedback that we developed additional opportunities for schools to expand to K-6, which we will describe later. And as Nate mentioned earlier, academic research tells us that standalone middle schools can create transitions that are disruptive to students, and disruptions from which they can, in some cases, never recover. The data about choice and enrollment in Boston shows us that families choose our standalone middle schools as a last resort. The combination of academic research and family voice and choice is compelling enough argument for us to move to either a K-6, 7-12 or K-8, 9-12 configuration.
So this is just some beginning of detail, maybe a teaser trailer for the presentation in in a couple of weeks about the work around the McCormick and other K-6 expansions. Because there's interrelated strands of work here, but there are separate issues and accompanying requests of the school committee's time, I wanted to provide a little bit of clarity about kind of the different asks and the different proposals we'll be bringing before you both this evening and then in subsequent sessions. So there's one stream that's connected to our reconfiguration of the McCormick, which is currently a 6 to 8 school, and we'll be bringing you a proposal for the McCormick staff merging with a high school staff to design a 712 for the location of the current McCormick 6-8. And so as we do that work, there's a need to look at the ecosystem of K-5 schools that are currently feeding the McCormick. And the transformation of the McCormick to a 712 necessitates conversations with all of those schools about moving to K-6. And so when we bring you the proposal around the McCormick, we'll also be discussing the 6 K-5 schools that currently feed the McCormick and the plans for those schools transitioning to K-6. A second work stream is in response to the feedback Charles just talked about. When we put our proposal out initially in the fall, the plan was that we would only think about these 6th grade additions to our K-5 schools when we were thinking about a middle school transformation. So we would do the South Boston and North Dorchester feeders when we were talking about McCormick. We would think about the Roslindale K-5s when we were thinking about the Irving. We would think about the Roxbury schools when we were thinking about the Timilty. What we heard loud and clear was that there's a real appetite for making the move to K-6 sooner, and a push for us to examine and vet scenarios under which we could make some of those transitions more quickly. So that's a second set of recommendations we'll be bringing to you of some additional K-6 expansions that will happen during the 2021 or 21-22 school year, so that we can respond to this community's desire to move more quickly in K-6 expansion. And then the third stream is K-6 expansions that are further out because they're connected to a middle school that we're not yet in the process of transforming, and because the schools themselves are not able to make that more rapid shift to K-6. So the McCormick, as I said, we'll bring to you on the 22nd, and we'll be talking about the McCormick and its high school partner, but we'll also be talking about this group of schools that are the feeders for the McCormick. At this point, 5 of the schools we've engaged with all of the communities multiple times. For 5 of the schools, we've sort of arrived at a clear pathway to 6th grade that ensures both a sustainable configuration for the school and also that the school is serving not just a general ed populations, but a high needs special ed and English language population. In a couple of cases where we haven't quite landed at the final configuration, so there'll be ongoing conversations with the Russell. And in addition to that, we're in conversation with the Perry, which is currently a K-8. It's in the same area as the McCormick, and they've made a request to actually reconfigure to become a K-6 rather than a K-8. So we'll be bringing that plan to you as well. And then in this second group, we did put out a request for schools to raise their hand and say they were interested in trying to get to a K-6 sooner than the timeline that would involve the middle school in their area. We had 14 schools that raised their hand and said they're very interested, and so we are currently vetting those proposals against the criteria that we shared when we made the offer of the opportunity available to school communities. And we do intend to bring you a group of those 14 schools that would either convert to K-6 in the 2021 school year or the 21-22 school year.
As Charles mentioned in the discussion of the engagement, we've been asked often why we don't move more quickly on this reconfiguration plan. I was talking with a parent a couple weeks ago who just said, we're ready, just rip the Band-Aid off. Mm-hmm. And I think the reality is that we are dealing with a number of implementation concerns, not the least of which is the existing building stock, the current buildings that we have. This is also a consideration for why we are not looking at more K-8s, because the reality is that we're limited by a building stock that's often not big enough for schools to be converted to K-8, and we need more space at the elementary level to be able to serve both special education students and general education students at the elementary level. And it's our middle schools and our secondary schools where we have the extra capacity, extra space in our system. And so the reality is that moving to add more K-6 schools and 7 to 12 schools is the fastest and most effective path for us to be reducing transitions in our system in a thoughtful way. And reflecting that reality, when we announced the updated plans, you may have seen this map before. It highlighted the areas of the city where we announced we were exploring possibilities for new construction. 4 of those dots in blue with the ES for elementary school around Roslindale, Roxbury, Jackson Square, Hyde Park, and the Roxbury-Dorchester area were all buildings that we had identified because the elementary schools in that area were too small for us to transition to a K-6, 7, 12 path with their existing buildings. That we couldn't move away from the middle schools, or we couldn't add 6th grade to the schools without additional classrooms in the area. And so this is part of the reason that we are seeking your approval for an endorsement of our plan, because we want the community to have a policy that reinforces the planning, and so that we have a common agreement when we engage with our communities around the path forward as we consider these new builds and the uses for existing school buildings that often take multiple years to plan for and multiple years to implement. And the endorsement of a K-6, 7, 12 pathway is not meant to be an indication we are moving away from our K-8s. We've said that a few times tonight, but we want to emphasize this point because we expect that a high percentage of our students will continue to enroll in K-8s and 9 through 12 pathways, even when this next phase of Build BPS is complete. And our commitment is not just lip service to say we'll let them exist. This is really a commitment to make sure that we're taking proactive steps to design the system so that K-8s are reinforced, that families don't feel like they have to leave a K-8 in order to get a seat in a high demand 7 to 12. And it's also, we want to monitor the implementation as we roll this out so that we're learning from how the expansions of schools in one area of the city, the expansion of 7 to 12s in one area of the city, have those knock-on effects in all of our school communities. And finally, I'll just end again on the slide that shows the proposal that we're asking for your approval on. And just note, our emphasis in terms of the K-6, 7, 12 pathway is really a reflection on what the research tells us is best for students, what our district has revealed through student choice and family choice in the way that our families have been navigating the system, and in the realities of the landscape that we have of our existing buildings. And for that reason, we're asking for your endorsement of this policy. And with that, I will turn it over to the chair for questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cooter and Assistant Superintendent Driscoll and Chief Academic Officer Granson. I know you're joined by Ms. Roberts from the Engagement Office as well tonight. Thank you for this comprehensive proposal. I want to thank you as well for the memorandum that the district circulated among the membership earlier this week that spelled out in much greater detail a preview of what your presentation was tonight. And, you know, as the superintendent noted at the outset, and you've mentioned a couple times in the presentation tonight, this is the first of 2 presentations on this subject. And this is the very broad view tonight that talks about the general approach that the district's intending to take with respect to grade reconfiguration going forward. But then next week we'll get very specific, or excuse me, next meeting on May 22nd, we'll get very specific on what exactly the proposed plans will be for the McCormick, as well as some of these other K-5s that have stepped up and said, you know, we want to get in on the K-6 movement in the near future. So, you know, for my own interests, I think there's nothing more important than this work that has happened over the last year in this district. This is the type of important work that starts to provide a pathway for us to make more consistent assignment across our district, create more consistent programs and resources for those programs across the district, and in turn then create more consistent experiences for our students all across the district as well. And so I'm very excited to get this work going. I think the district owes a great debt to the leadership of Interim Superintendent Perill, as well as each of you, for driving the bus on this issue and keeping us focused on trying to do what it is that is possible within the current structure that we have, and setting us up for a structure that incorporates the additional buildings that we'll be able to create through the Build BPS process over the next decade. So with that, I do want to open it up to members. I do want to, and when I do that, I do remind members once again that we will have a second half of this proposal. So anything specific to McCormick or any of those other schools you heard about, or some of the specific proposals, will come at the next meeting. Ms. Robinson,
Yes.
will you lead us off?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I'm personally excited about the K to 6, 7 to 12. I was a kid in BPS who went to a K to 5, a 6th grade, and a 7 to 12, and I'll tell you, the 6th grade still was the nightmare year that I think about 50 years later. So I would love for kids not to have this happen. I'm also excited to hear about the potential of creating more K to 6s sooner than later. But my big concern, again, is what happens to the middle schools, because the worst thing will be to say to them, you have declining enrollments. We will have created the issue for declining enrollment for those programs. And how will we make sure that during this transition, that schools who are impacted will have the kind of monies that they will need to do a great job for the kids that they have during this, and not feel like they're being penalized because we have created new opportunities for the 6th grade class that will now not be showing up at their doors.
I think there's two ways that we're thinking about that. One is, as we're making decisions about which schools will add a 6th grade, we're looking at where the current 5th graders go, transition to for 6th grade, and thinking about what the impact would be on those receiving schools if we were to suddenly, as you say, not have the 6th graders that's transitioning to the next school. And so some of the decision-making will be based on whether, in fact, we're able to mitigate that impact, either by shifting feeder patterns from other schools, or, financially by just sort of replacing the lost enrollment with dollars that, they would have received had we not shifted their enrollment. The other thing is that all of our middle schools are part of our high support networks, and so as such, they are receiving more regular support, both from an academic superintendent who's there weekly for coaching, and then from a team of liaisons that's able to support with content expertise, with cell-well expertise, with data expertise. And that's, the network structure is something that we've really been working on developing over this year, and look forward to even further enhancements next year. All of those schools, all of our middle schools are also writing transformation plans with DESE, and so there are some additional dollar resources that will be available to them to support the implementations of the strategies in those plans. But we are very much aware that it's a delicate balance. We're checking in with those schools on what trends we're seeing around human capital, and whether teachers are in fact feeling like, I should look for a job now rather than waiting the 2 or 3 or 5 years. And so it's definitely very much front of mind as we do this work, that while we're responding to communities that want to move forward, we also need to think about the communities that will be impacted, and particularly our middle schools, because they serve some of our most vulnerable learners.
As we're looking at this, I'm also wondering what's happening at the lower end. So I know that we have some of our early learning centers, our pre-K to 1 or 2, and I know that they've had in the past some issues around enrollment too, as people jump ship to try to get their kid into a different kindergarten so they'll have that trajectory. So if we're going to be increasing at the 6th grade levels, what's happening as we're also trying to expand at the 4-year-old level? How are we balancing those two things out?
I think there's a couple things you've noted. The K1, the EECs and ELCs that serve grades K1 or K0 through first grade have that same challenge that the K to 5s do, which is that families start to exit in K2 or first grade as they get the seats in either the K to 8 or K to 5 that they'll eventually transition into. We have an EEC, ELC that does have a pathway, and that we do see that has reduced that sort of exiting. And we're having conversations with the EECs and ELCs about this process and potentially creating those sort of feeder patterns through the UPK work, Universal Pre-K work, and we're doing a lot more work to work with the community-based partners around expanding access for fourth grade seats. We've also made a commitment to look within BPS and think about ways that we can find more fourth grade seats, four-year-old seats.
4-year-old.
Did I say fourth grade?
Fourth grade, yeah. That's a little old.
Sorry. Sorry. Four-year-old classrooms, the preschool seats. I'm wondering how many of my comments I have to revise now as I think about it. And so there is a trade-off in terms of a K to 6 expansion, and it's a trade-off of where we can expand K1 seats, where we can expand different programs or simplified programs for families. And so we're looking at both. The big opportunities for us to expand pre-K seats will come when we are able to reconfigure one of our middle school buildings or have a new building come online. And we're continuously evaluating that as we start to look at universal pre-K for 4-year-olds.
I just have one more question. As we're thinking about, well, we have the fact that many of our schools are small. Is there any consideration in thinking of 2 campus schools that would come together to create a K to 6, perhaps? You know, thinking about, one the single strand schools particularly, where it's difficult.
Absolutely, and we have some examples of that in the K to 8 world where we have 2 campus K8s. And we know, because we have schools that are just too small to become a K6, that in some cases, the 2 campus solution will be the right solution. I think we have some schools that are already percolating those ideas, and we probably look forward to having them come to us. At this point, we're really entertaining working with schools that can do it within their own building, but in subsequent waves of the work, it would be probably inviting proposals for 2 campus solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Dr. Coleman?
Thank you. I know this is a very complex and demanding work, and keeping you this late at night, it makes it a little bit more difficult. But I do have a couple questions just to kind of help me think this through. I want to start with, I think the idea of reducing transitions is a great, wonderful idea, fully supported. I think I'm hoping that one of the great outcomes is that once families know they're going to be in this K6 and the 712, a longer transition, they'll be more committed to what happens afterwards, and so they get more invested in the district as a whole. I think I'm hoping that's a positive outcome. But so one of my questions, and this is more as much for all presentations as this in particularly, is that I'm hoping that we can start more with, and it's something I don't love. Many of my colleagues love these theory of logic models, but where you really organize a presentation about what the outcome we're looking for, and that kind of be front and center, and all the factors we're talking about, we see what is the potential relationship to that outcome. In my mind, it's reducing achievement gaps as identified by demographic groups. So if we start there, and you go beginning the presentation with the 8 guiding principles of Build BPS, really talk about how that will reduce the gap, and lay that out in a more straightforward format, I think will be helpful for us over time, so we can begin to compare, think through whether this is actually meeting we talk about equity statements, which I think are important, but really we're talking about closing gap statements and how this is a gap closing measure. So that's one broader comment to think that through. But in terms of responsive questions, help me understand your thinking about how you think this change will impact charter school enrollment. So what evidence do we have that in some way this may reduce the involvement in charter schools or support, kids' choices in a way that's more rational and supportive of our enrollment. I'm not necessarily saying historically, a lot of people claim I'm anti-charter, but I'm trying to be nicer about that in my public presentations.
So in terms of the sort of logic around how we think this will impact, what we see, the charter schools have configured, there's a number of charter schools, and the majority of charter schools are those 5 through 12. What that offers to families in Boston is basically almost other than our EEZs and ELCs, that 5 through 12 offers you the opportunity to be a guaranteed single transition pathway, that I transition to 5th grade, and if I do come back to the district for one of our 7-12s or 9-12s, that's my choice. But if I don't, I'm guaranteed 5 through 12. The reason that we think this will have some impact on the charter school exit at that point is because we see a difference in the exit rates for our K-8s. Those families that already know they're guaranteed only one transition in our system, K through 12, are sticking around, and it's depending on the year, 2 to 5% different. And that is a small percentage overall, but it can mean the difference in terms of viability. So what we think is, in the same way that the pathway has impacted the EEC, that families know where they're going, by getting families to that transition point where we already see a lot of turnover, with 23 or 25% of our 7th graders enrolled in one of our existing 7-12s, that's a lot of turnover at that transition point. So a lot of families are basically saying, get us to that transition point. Let's see where we end up enrolling. And then by expanding the options in BPS, the high quality options at 7-12, and by getting families to that transition, we think we'll see a lot less turnover. And as a result, we may see some of the charter schools reconfigure and change their grade spans in the same way that we've seen some of our parochial schools in Boston reconfigure to address the historical pathways that exist within BPS. So this is again a theory. We're gonna, in terms of the pilot cohort that we're coming forward, both in terms of the schools that will reconfigure as a result of the McCormick and the schools that will reconfigure to K-6 as part of that initial pilot phase of the sort of non-reconfiguration. That'll give us the opportunity to sort of test that theory on a limited case and see how full those schools become, and if we see an impact on their enrollment in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade when families are exiting.
Great, that's very helpful. So my next question, starting with the broad concern that I'm trying to understand. I hear the reason why we're keeping K-8s and 9-12, but really want to push our thinking, saying that why not move mostly to K-6? Because we have a built-in structure in our school, our district with the exam schools, where we are already creating this highly desirable, some think, option for the exam schools, that's 7-12, and doesn't that have an impact on K-8 enrollment? So the fact that many people go to the exam schools, how does that keep enrollment in K-8s, or how do we think through that issue? Or when you look at the data, how does that impact K-8s?
Dr. Coleman, I'll take this one for starters, and they can back me up if I miss any key points. But I think the first thing to just reiterate to everyone, and we really wanted to bring this data forward, is that for us, this question of the 2 most viable pathways relates to history and context and landscape in Boston, patterns of historic family choice and desire. So it's both the realities of our physical landscape, what we know about family choice and desire historically, and then a recognition of where our children are currently and already. And so I think it's the data that shows that we actually have 9 schools that are in the 6 or 7th grade through 12 means that this conversation is beyond just about the exam schools. So I want to make sure we recognize that we have a number of schools that are in this 6 to 12. That said, Boston also has a long and successful history in many ways of expanding to a number of K-8s, which on the one hand was done very aggressively over the past 5 to 15 years, and that had a dramatic impact on our middle schools, but it did create a number of highly chosen, very viable, well-sustained K-8s. We see no reason to disturb that, and we also have a number of, again, sustainable, highly chosen, high-functioning 9 to 12s that are not, we cannot make them all 7 to 12s. And so we have a number of things to preserve, and we have settled on this dual pathway, knowing that, whether you count it at 15 different grade configurations plus the 9 programs, or you add it all together to have a really dramatic number, we have an awful lot of grade configurations. This is not a uniform landscape. We're simply trying to reduce them to the most viable. So we did not think that uniformity was the appropriate approach, nor was it practical or feasible.
I didn't advocate for uniformity. I said mostly. So that
right.
So I want to
and
be
so
clear
that's
about
okay.
the difference there. So
and we think we have the balance, and I also just want to point out, because the district has done this before, where you head down a path, you don't think about unintended consequences, and then you have unexpected enrollment impacts where you didn't expect it. Now, there will be enrollment impacts that we may not even anticipate coming from different directions and not our choice of grade configuration. So I want to make sure that we all know that this is a fairly iterative process. But as an example, for the growth of additional 7 to 12s, one of the things we will keep an eye on, and we've talked about as a design principle, is in some places we may want to keep the 7th and 8th grade smaller and make sure that the size of the school grows at the 9th grade. So it's a real choice option for families to keep their kids all the way through that K-8 before they make the jump, so we don't see families peeling out of K-8s in the 7th grade because they want to get into that desirable school. We want to make sure that there are 2 entry points into any of those 7 to 12s for a number of our students. So that's sort of the way we're balancing.
Thank you. And I do want to keep track of it, so, because there are other problems of practice that I think are central to some of the issues. Some of our most challenged schools are our 9 to 12 comprehensives, right? And many other 9 to 12s, I'll take BGA as an example, felt that they would be better served going 7, 12, so they could capture kids earlier and prepare them for those high school years. And so I just want to articulate that as one of the things to think through, that when we see the big problems, English High, Charleston, in our system, they are 9-12s. And would they be served would we improve their performance? Would it be serving gap closing measures if we supported their ability to get kids earlier and longer, is one of the questions I just want to keep on in our at the front of our mind. I know every people think about it. And then someone talked about pairing. I know that other districts have used pairing, so you have 2 schools that are paired as a way to address integration, where they take schools that have been historically been in one racial group and another, and they consciously pair as a way of moving kids consciously between those 2 demographic housing patterns. So just a thought on the mind. But thank you. This is very important work.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, like my 2 colleagues so far, I fully support and applaud this work that the district has been doing, and particularly finally seeing this data, which we have not seen in a while, has been very helpful. But I also appreciate the commitment to the dual approach, right? We have all searched repeatedly for research on what's the right model to have, and we can all point to other districts that say we're doing great with K to 6, 7 to 12, and others say we're doing great with K to 9 or K to 8, 9 to 12. We cannot find, everyone can find research on either side. The only research we can't find is something that supports the middle school model, right? So I really appreciate, particularly in light of all the school communities that work so hard to be K to 8, I appreciate the recognition of that and the commitment to keeping that if schools decide to say that model. I actually anticipate that some in the future, because of the drop-off to charter schools and exam schools, and the smaller populations they have in 7th and 8th, and still have to commit resources to that under weighted student funding, I wouldn't be surprised if some asked to go to a K-6 model. I think you mentioned the Perry may be interested in that as an example. And if that allows the schools to expand their offerings to more students in a K-6 level, that would be great, because I am concerned, as Ms. Robinson brought up, is when schools go from K-5 to K-6, and you have in here, Mr. Kuda, the example of many of our buildings are struggling to be able to actually go to K-6. What happens to the ability to offer more kindergarten seats? And that is where the demand is right now. And so, and that raises the question of what data are we using to understand what the potential inflow is going to be? How do we know how many 1, 2, and 3-year-olds there are in this city?
So we've begun, over the last year, we've really begun to partner much more closely with the Boston Planning and Development Agency to do demographic trends, multi-year projections of demographics by neighborhood. It's been an exciting partnership for us data nerds to be able to get better access to a lot of the community survey data. We have not traditionally, again, when it comes to predicting our enrollment patterns, the number of 1, 2, and 3-year-olds is not as predictive as we'd like it to be, because there's so much noise around families that are exiting before even getting to school age. And then, of course, we know that there are a number of families that register who don't get a seat, who then decide to either leave the district or leave the city. It's a narrative we hear in every community meeting. So from our own internal data set, we are watching registrations very closely, both the number of K0, K1, and K2 registrations, how those have changed over the years. You know, it used to be that we continuously saw a rise in the number of families that register from K1 to K2, from K2 to grade 1, because grade 1 is the first compulsory year. Because of the push for more K1 seats, and because of the understanding of early childhood, we've seen a lot more registrations, a higher percentage of school-age kids registering at that K1 level. We've also, and this is where the really exciting work has been with the Boston Planning and Development Agency. We're working with them to understand what developments are in the pipeline, and to then begin to make estimates for the number of school-age children that we will yield from those developments based on the size and cost and location of those developments. And so oftentimes we'll hear families say, but you're projecting a decline at my school, but they're building a brand new housing complex at the end of my street. What we're able to know is that housing complex at the end of your street, how many units are going to be in it, how big is it going to be, how much is it going to cost, and what does that tell us about the number of families that we typically get from that. And so that's really exciting, and it's also telling us a lot about the biggest factor affecting our enrollment is the demographic trend of families aging in place and families having children later in life and fewer children. And so this is far more impactful than the number of families who say they leave because of schools or the number of new housing starts that are happening. We have a population, the baby boomers are aging, they're not leaving the city. We have families, I was talking with somebody today who their daughter is a senior at Fenway. They're not planning to move out of JP just because their daughter's graduating from Fenway. That's a house where we get 1 student. Next year we'll get 0 students from it. That trend is very impactful on our enrollment, and it's something that we've gained insights around. So we're doing a lot more to try and understand that data, to try and get early indicators of registration, and it's all been exciting work, and it does help us glean more insights and make sure that when we're looking at these large projects in neighborhoods that are 6 to 8 years in the making, we've identified a number of places in our city where we need elementary seats. One of the questions we often get asked is, how do you know that by the time you build that building, you're not going to be closing other buildings because of it? And the reality is that we know that a lot of these places that we've targeted for new buildings, the mismatch between seats and buildings is so stark that we could build that building and we would have to take a major demographic shift to not need it in the future. And then in other places, even if we built a brand new building, it would help to replace some of our buildings that are over 90 or 100 years old in our neighborhoods.
So thank you, Mr. Kudo. I find it interesting that you're getting data from estimates from Planning and Development, which is a great organization. And yes, they're aware, and it's nice that we're finally having that cooperation, right? So I'm aware of none of those conversations around planning for the seaport. And yet now that Suffolk Downs is going to be built out, the fact that we're proactively having conversations, just as one example of a big development in the city and what the expectation is there. But it leads me to, last week we had a member of the public testify that had a very simple solution, and I wonder if the city has been asked. As residents, we all fill out a survey, and we have to put on it how many dogs we have. Have we talked with the city about saying, how many children do you have, how old they are? Are you interested in Boston Public Schools? It's required for residents to actually fill that out. We should be asking that question, and it'd be great if we actually reach out to the city folks that handle that census and ask if they can ask those questions. Because I think it would be much more robust data to actually have the replies from citizens themselves. And yes, I understand that people come and go, and I can tell you in Charlestown, where I live, there are a lot of parents who want to stay in the city, but then we heard from some earlier tonight, and we heard from last time as well. I was crossing the street in Charlestown this morning, and as I stood at the lights, I literally counted 9 baby carriages of people pushing children in baby carriages. And those are folks who are leaving the city if they can't get seats. And so it begs the question to me of what are we going to do? We don't talk yet about this in this plan. I'm not sure if we're going to talk in the next one. What are we going to do with the middle schools? And how many are we also thinking about, okay, if we have a elementary school that's filled and can't give more K1, K2 seats or more strands, and we have a middle school nearby, are we thinking of a two-campus solution, as you talked about, Ms. Driscoll, and potentially, making a K-3 and 4-8 or 4-6, or?
Absolutely. The reason the McCormick was proposed to transition to 712 is it's in one of the parts of the city where we actually have excess capacity.
Oh, I understand.
In our
Yeah, no, I'm not
schools.
knocking about McCormick at all.
But
Talking about some of
when
the
we think
others.
about, I often go to the Irving because it's Rosendale, which is my neighborhood, and that's a place where we don't have enough seats. All of our K-5s in that area are chock full, and there's students who can't get seats in Rosendale who are going into other neighborhoods. So the Irving, we're very clear, will not be transformed into another 712. That will become a K6, and either potentially 2 of the smaller Rosendale schools could, decide to co-locate and merge and inhabit that school, or, one small school could move in there, expand and become bigger, and then the empty building they leave could become the second campus site for another Rosendale school. But
And I'm assuming that's a potential option in Charlestown as well, with the Edwards?
yes, yeah, at the point, again, the Edwards is in a place where there's definitely a need for elementary seats.
Thank you. I also noticed on slide 8 where you talked about, so we have 36 schools that are K-5 and 1 that's K-6. And then you lay out, we're potentially looking at up to 15 to move to K-6. That's great. And I do appreciate that. But right now, we only have 5 schools that are 7 to 12, of which 3 of them are exam schools. So that means there's only 2 non-exam schools that are 7 to 12. I assume we are doing the same amount of work about high schools that will expand to 7 and 12, because if we're saying to parents you're going to have a choice of K-6, 7 to 12, we have to make sure we have high schools prepared to be 7 to 12. And just before you answer that, I concur with what Dean Coleman said, and I second it. Every high school leader I've spoken to in this city wants to go to 7 to 12, everyone. And they say it to me not because they actually want to run a 7 to 12 school, but they say they want the students earlier, that they're coming to them too far behind. And they recognize that they want that ability to work with them academically earlier. So I know there's great interest in almost every high school. Yes, some of the smaller ones may struggle going from 9 to 12 to 7 to 12, but are we doing the commensurate work to make sure we have enough seats on the high school side in the 7th and 8th grade?
Sorry, I was distracted. I think there's a typo on that slide. I think there's only 4 7 to 12s in our district and
Okay.
4 6 through 12. So I apologize. I'm surprised I didn't catch that earlier. But
8, not 9.
there's 8, not 9 in that configuration.
What is the 4th 7 to 12 outside of? I was racking my brain. I couldn't think of it.
New mission.
New mission.
A new mission, right? Oh, because we just moved them to them. That's right.
And that's part of the beginning answer. So yes,
Yes.
there's work on this, but yeah, new mission.
And I think what happened here was I was counting the configuration of the McCormick, which we are working towards.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think the two parts to that. Well, the first is the work that they're doing on the middle grades working group. That's not a middle school working group. It's not a K-8 working group. It's not a 7-12 working group. It's about setting the expectations for what the middle grades instruction needs to look like, what the opportunities for students needs to look like in those middle grades. It will include learnings from people who were part of transitions to K-8 and expansion of K-8s like Mary, and learning from NAEA and the best kept secret in high school in the nation, right, with New Mission. We need to learn from them in their transition and help create a playbook for schools as they think about this. And it's often, I've heard Laura say this a number of times, I've heard a lot of the academic staff say, you can't think of 6th graders as just bigger 5th graders. You can't think of 7th graders as just smaller high school students. It is a different transition, and we need to think about supporting and learning from the success we have. And so part of the, there's not a lot of, we're not talking about the movement in terms of 7-12s, at least initially, because we know the 7-12s will have a significant impact both on the K-8s in the area and the middle schools in the area. And so we really want to be thoughtful about the expansion of those 7-12s at the time that we take middle school capacity offline, because a lot of these elementary schools, because they're so small, may affect 10, 12 students at an overall middle school. When we take a 7-12 and put them online, we're talking about probably at least 2 cohorts of students, so somewhere in the order of magnitude of 50 students, and really we're looking at probably closer to 80 or 100 students as a capacity in that 7th grade. That can have just, at that point, you've decided to close those middle schools in the area. And what we want to do, New Mission had a significant effect on a number of the schools in the areas, and schools that we think of as our really strong high demand schools. The Roosevelt being the example that is often used, because 9 students left the Roosevelt. Again, it doesn't sound like a lot, but that can have a really big impact on the budget.
Right.
And so part of that will be as part and parcel where we think about reconfiguring the middle schools. We will think about the high schools in the area. So to piggyback on the Irving example, if we start thinking about the Irving, there are 3 high schools right in the area that we will be thinking about whether or not it makes sense, space-wise, program-wise, enrollment-wise, to expand 7-12 right at that point. And thinking about it for where those students enroll as well.
Thank you. And I do note that this was an issue we specifically talked about with Dr. Casilius in her public interview. And she expressed the opinion that while she was supportive of the look at it, there should always still be a middle school model, even if it's in a high school. That, as we all know, and as we hear from the teachers at the McCormick and others, that the students in those transition years of 7th, 8th, and 9th grade are different, and that the teachers who teach those students are different, and that a middle school model, even it would be it in a high school or in a K-8, is very important to have. And so I assume she'll be extremely involved in this process moving forward.
She will, and yeah, you're looking at a middle grade teacher right in the middle there who can vouch for that statement. But we have said repeatedly, but it bears mentioning again here, that again, the middle grades working group that Mary is leading is not about middle schools, but about a recognition that they are middle graders, whether you put them in a 6 to 8, a K to 8, a 7 to 12, and thus their particular needs must be met. And we have, many really, truly excellent middle grades educators, and there will be very important roles for them. And in addition to we talked about a design principle to make sure that some of the high schools had space for incoming 9th graders. Another one of the design principles, particularly under renovations or new builds, is looking at separate spaces, separate entrances, not exclusively, but there are lots of different ways to create protected areas, for student learning, and collaborative and engaging areas for student learning. So we expect that design principles will also be part of this too.
Excellent. Great to hear. And the last point is, and I'm sure my colleagues are going to bring this up as well, we haven't talked much yet about family and school community engagement on this. I'll strictly make the statement that, and I see Ms. Roberts is right behind, but that this is critical, that communities feel like the McCormick does now, but did not feel initially, that this is a conversation, not a decision that is being forced on them. And that is so critical as we start to talk about these other communities as well. And I know there's sensitivity to it, that's great. I just feel it's important that we have that on the table. Thank you.
I will just briefly say we can certainly go into greater depth between Monica and Mary, but there have been multiple engagements with school parent councils, with school site councils, with written communication, with planning sessions, and I think you obviously see the evidence in the McCormick, but in the case of both the McCormick expansion schools, you saw that there were 7 schools eligible, only 5 are likely to be recommended. That's after conversations with those communities, and the 2 that aren't are ones that had issues or more complications. We listened to that and said, okay, we can wait because we have enough that are potentially ready to go. And similarly, the proposal that we'll be bringing in a couple of weeks around the citywide K-6 expansions is in direct response to community feedback from those schools who said, hey, that idea that we should wait until there's a middle school conversion and then we get to go, like, that's not okay. We've been waiting for 3 years. We've been waiting for 5 years. And so both of those, I think, are examples of the additional community engagement and collaborative planning that is embedded in this.
I assume that one of those schools will be a school that I know fairly well because I sat in 6th grade in that building. But time will tell when that comes out because, as opposed to Ms. Robinson, I was K-6, 7 to 12, so I didn't have that transition year, and so I agree with your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Vice Chair Oliver Davila.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you for your presentation. I also agree that I am glad to hear about the thoughtfulness and the dual approach because I think, and I'm very glad too we're having this conversation. It has nothing to do with external funding because when I look back in time at smaller schools, you know, we have to make decisions on what is best for our students and families. And I do appreciate the thought around what will happen, you know, if we went 7 to 12 and how that affects other, you know, schools. So we, as much as we can, we're not always going to anticipate all the things that may happen, but to really be thoughtful is really important. And I ditto all the comments around making sure that we, even if we have middle schools moving into high schools and that 7 to 12, it is middle school, and that's really critical time for our students. You couldn't pay me enough money to go back to middle school. It was awful. And I think, you know, there's a lot of hormones, a lot of other stuff. It's a tough time, so it's really important to have, you know, staff that know how to work in those middle grades. And so one of my questions is, as we move forward, maybe you can't answer that now, but, you know, what happens to the staffing in the middle schools? And does that staff, you know, migrate to the new school, like how that is going to work? And I guess I'm asking that because I want to make sure that staff who really are effective, you know, and experienced in working with those middle school students can move into that 7 to 12 space.
Yeah, I completely agree. As someone who was first a middle school teacher and then a middle school principal, I firmly believe it's a very acquired taste.
It is.
And that only people who truly love and want to work with middle school students should be in those classrooms doing that work. And so, you know, with the McCormick, we actually, you know, saw that being able to preserve the knowledge of how to work well with middle school students in the McCormick staff, to bring that to knowledge of how to work well with high school students, that, you know, although mergers are difficult and the challenges of, you know, merging vision and mission, you know, has its complications, the idea that we're bringing together expertise in 2 very different areas of youth development, I think is going to be a real value add to that work. In the case of these K-6 expansions, one of the things that Charles and I will work on together is ensuring that we sort of create a suite of training for the sixth grade teachers who are going to take the positions in those schools, whether they be a current fifth grade teacher who decides they want to go up a grade, or a sixth grade teacher from an existing middle school that's going to transition. But we're going to use it as an opportunity to really do some district-wide work around what does excellent education look like for sixth graders, regardless of where they're sitting.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you. And so you mentioned schools having to submit proposals, and you mentioned also there was a lot of family engagement. In the proposals, is there something that is proof that the families have been engaged? So, I say this because I don't want to come to another school committee meeting, 6 months from now, and people are coming and saying, no one talked to us. So how are we gauging that families really want this? And where's the beef?
So it was actually a statement of interest, not so much a proposal. We just asked schools to sort of raise their hand. We did ask for sign off from both the school leader, from a BTU member, and from a site council member. Granted that you could have just one signature and it could be just one person who knows about it. We then did, as Nate mentioned, do multiple opportunities to engage communities. That work is still very much a work in progress. We went early in the morning, we went in the evening, we went to the school, we had central locations. Certainly we're continuing to be sure we're looking for opportunities to engage in all of the communities. As schools have their end of year events, we're going to make sure that there's conversations as families are coming in to pick up report cards or for end of year performances, so that they know what's happening with the schools. And that was the same with the high schools. As we were evaluating potential partners, we went out to each high school community to meet with we saw family members, we saw partners, we saw staff members, but we still know that who we saw was just a very small sample of who the entirety of those communities are.
Yeah, that would be great. Did you want to?
Yeah, so the other thing that we're doing through the application process, we're also just vetting for who actually can we move forward with. And those school communities that we think we can move forward with will receive some additional engagement of their school communities before we finally say, yes, this one is moving forward. So that is part of the work we're doing with the K-6s. I will say at the high school level with the 712s, we also made sure that we were engaging students as part of the process, and encourage, as our schools are visiting, which you'll hear much more about in a couple of weeks, that there are students part of the team that was going to look at the partner schools. So we wanted to make sure, particularly at the high school level, that student voice was also reflected.
That's great. Thank you for adding that, and also for the partners. In my own self-interest, we run a program at the Timilty. So as a partner, I would want to know, because that would very much affect our program. So I'm glad that you're talking to partners as well, because they are part of the equation. And then I really liked that you talked about the focus on rigor, because I think some of the chart around the migration to charters, and yes, I agree that looking at one data point, you can say that the K to 8s don't have as much transition. That's a great data point, yes. But I have the data point of life, which is just talking to families and hearing many times that it's part of the reason for leaving has to do with rigor program, what the school really can offer versus what a charter school can offer. So I really think that is that parallel conversation is really, really important. And I guess my question is around the migration to charters. Although we have the percentages, that's just looking at percentages, but do we have the ability to talk to families to better understand why they're leaving? Is that part of the work that was done, the assessment in this, or this is just a straight up chart and with no conversations with families who have gone to charters?
Yeah, so this review is just a review of the current enrollment patterns and where families exit, looking at the difference between the sort of the pathways for K to 6, for K to 8, versus the K to 5s. We don't currently do, as far as I know, I'm looking at Monica, we don't do any sort of exit surveys of families about why they leave and why they chose. It is something that we have talked about in terms of just Build BPS overall, is just knowing, even when we see, we have a treasure trove of data around family choice, but we don't have the why behind it. And so I do think that's something that we can think about designing, both in terms of as they enter and rank schools, why they're choosing the way they do. And then if they exit, following up and trying to get information about them, but it's not currently in the.
Yeah, I didn't think that you had it, but I thought I would ask. And the reason I say that is just, I think all of us, as we walk around in our daily life, have talked to plenty of parents. I'm a charter parent, so, and that wasn't my choice, but you all know the story, because every time I have an opportunity, I always bring it up. But I think that we put such a heavy investment on early childhood education, which I'm not against, but I feel like we are constantly forgetting the 6th through the 12th grade. And so when I talk to families, it's about the rigor, it's about what programs are offered, it's about safety. So all of those pieces, I just want to make sure that we are very consciously aware that this is not, this strategy is not going to fix all of the issues that we have. And so that's why I do think focusing on the rigor, focusing on what we offer, and adding a longer school day, as we've done in other schools. I know charters have a longer school day, so those kinds of things make a huge difference. So it's not really, I guess, a question, more of a statement.
And Ms. Oliver Davila, if I can just pick up on that, because I think you raise a really important point, and I just want to underscore the extent to which that's already in our thinking, that we are talking about, and it actually goes back, Dr. Coleman, to some of your comments as well. We are obviously talking about a structural solution, and one of the reasons that, while we didn't go into great depth, we wanted to make sure that Dr. Granson was talking about some of the current and initial and ongoing work, that we are very, very conscious of the fact that there is deep work to do to increase the rigor, to increase the levels of student engagement. We actually think, while we've focused our discussion of fewer transitions on family and student impact and family choice, there is simplifying and making more consistent our school pathways also allows greater opportunity for more intentional vertical alignment, which I think also goes to this question of, every school in the district wanting to go 7 to 12 so they can get them earlier. I think that's a piece of it. There are other dimensions going on there, which is about the consistency and rigor of instruction. So if as we make moves for rigor, that fear that I have to get my kids first so that, I control their destiny from 6th or 7th grade through 12th may diminish. I would also say that there's another major factor there that's actually an argument for this dual pathway, which is that the special ed and English learner concentrations that have been visited on some of our 9 to 12s are part of this dynamic as well. But I think the academic work, the instructional work, the work around rigor and student engagement are clearly part of this. And not only is structure not the only solution, but it's really only part of the answer. So I think we are all very aware of that. You'll hear more about that in the asset presentation in late June, but I think that has to be held front and center of the work of this district. Build BPS is about creating conditions, but it is what happens in those hallways and in those classrooms that ultimately matter, and so we cannot remove our focus from that as well.
Well, thank you, Vice Chair, and thank you, Superintendent.
Excuse me, Chair. Thank you for saying that. I mean, I worry sometimes in our obsession about Build PPS, we do miss that as our core work. And so thank you for articulating that.
I do want to say we do not miss it as our core work. It just so happens in these presentations that if we're taking you through a complicated structural analysis, and we're trying to observe the chair's, which we blew by today, guideline of 10 to 12 slides in presentation, that is why we don't try and do it all at once every time. But I do want to say repeatedly, and it's one of the reasons the asset presentation will be important, is that internally we hold this as a central concern and actually, again, see Build BPS as trying to clear some of the underbrush away so that can continue to be the core focus of the district.
We did hear earlier, I think she's gone now, from Jennifer Dines, who's a teacher at the Frederick, who talked about exactly that, the rigor that she feels has come into the Frederick because of the Excellence for All initiative that expanded and rolled up into 6th grade this year. So, that work is work that's underway across 16 schools to really think about what does it take to raise the rigor for all students, not just some students.
Well, thank you all, and I think that really brings me back to what my opening comments were here, which is, trying to create some stability within this system, particularly given that, and I believe it still remains rightfully so, dollars follow students, and dollars follow the attributes of our students across the district. That makes us best able to then properly resource for the programs that students need across this district, so long as we're actually capturing a critical mass of students within the school buildings and within the grades within those buildings that we truly need to in order to run the programs that we need. And so starting to undo some of the tangled web in which kids move through this system and utilize that as a source of strength to allocate those resources on a consistent basis is really the important work that I see this doing, and creating the space for us to then increase the rigor and provide the programs and services for our students. So I just want to reflect back once more. This is really great work, and this is really important work for the future and the health of our district, the sustainability of our district. And I really want to thank the superintendent once again and her team for putting together the conditions that allowed for schools to start thinking critically about how they could reach this point. We didn't have a pathway for schools to think about how they could go from K-5 to K-6 before this year. And so that's a very important piece in this process, and we appreciate that work being done. So we'll look forward to next time, May 22nd, when you'll be back to talk in more detail about the McCormick, and as well as the feeder patterns to the McCormick and some of those other K-5s that are looking to expand. And we will continue to follow that conversation in the coming weeks and months ahead. So thank you so much for giving us this baseline, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again in a few short weeks.
Thank you.
We'll move on now to public comment on reports. Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. LaConto. We have one speaker, Peggy Wiesenberg.
Thank you. As you look to moving to more coherence with these feeder patterns, I hope you bear in mind that in the past, feeder patterns have had a segregative effect in this district. And I think I was glad to hear that you'll be working with the Planning and Development Agency, because our city is more diverse, but it is also becoming more segregative. So I think it's something that we have to keep front and center, that what we want is excellent schools, but we want diverse schools. And as Hardin Coleman brought up, maybe in some cases we want to look at intentional pairings, not just neighborhood-based K-12 feeder patterns. I myself, when my first child started, there were magnet schools or geocoded schools, and she was assigned to her geocoded school. And then there was a feeder to a middle school and then a high school. And it didn't look good going up. So I intentionally moved my children many times, and they got great educations. But just having fewer transitions and a feeder pattern isn't necessarily good quality education for every student, which is what we want. So as we move forward, we just have to do it as best we can in a way that is fair and equitable and has the big picture as well as the individual configurations you're looking at. Thank you.
Ms. Wiesenberg.
Thank you. That concludes our speakers for public comment.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan, and that, oh, actually, I should ask, is there new business? Well, then that concludes our business for the evening. Our next school committee meeting will take place on Wednesday, May 22nd at 6 p.m. There's nothing further. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Vice Chair. Is there a second? Sounds like unanimous consent. Good night.